Xi Jinping is not a dictator. He has to satisfy his constituents.
Yeah, nobody cares about what's happening to the Uyghurs, okay?
And as a top-down country, what they're doing is that it's that kind of like a strict parent. They behave like a strict parent.
Markets don't like uncertainty. Markets like actually totalitarian governments where you have a understanding of what's out there, and obviously the whole dimension is changing now with, as you said, a democratization of countries, and democracies are very messy, as we know in the United States. You have opinions changing back and forth.
In April 1981, a young banker at Chase named Roger Robinson co-authored an op-ed in the New York Times entitled "Europe's Big Gamble on Soviet Gas." Robinson argued that the planned pipeline project between Siberia and Western Europe represented a vital threat to both Europe and America's national security and created a dependence that would come back to haunt Western societies. Ronald Reagan, upon reading that op-ed, hired Robinson to be the head of international economic policy and to implement the ideas in his op-ed in what subsequently became known as the Siberian Pipeline Dispute. The Reagan administration exerted sanctions on American and Western companies and firms and their subsidiaries in order to thwart the pipeline and to protect our Western societies from falling into this dependence. It didn't work. Ronald Reagan finally said, they can have their damn pipeline, but they won't do it with American money or American technology. 40 years later, the international community seems to have recognized that dependence on Russian oil and gas represents a vulnerability to our freedom, our prosperity, and our national security. Regretfully, the price for that 40-year delay is being paid on the front lines in Ukraine. But while we've woken up to the vulnerability of our dependence on Russia, by and large, Western society has not woken up to our dependence on the greatest future threat, the Chinese Communist Party. One major similarity between China and Russia is that their strategies to create dependencies in Western societies that they will abuse in their plans to harm us can only be achieved with the help of the elite members of our society. And while many people in this community are very much aware of the fact that our Wall Street firms and our banks and our corporations are working on behalf of increasing our dependence on Chinese government and the Chinese companies that aid it, what you may not know, or what many don't realize, is that that dependency is being shared with hundreds of millions of citizens in Western societies without their knowledge. Through a litany of means and schemes and investment vehicles, Wall Street firms and European banks and American banks are shoveling billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars, into the hands of the Chinese companies that build the concentration camps, that build the cameras that sit atop the concentration camp walls, that build the islands in the South China Sea and build the missiles that go on top of those islands, that support the cyber hacking of our governments and of our citizens. This is a conundrum for both American and Western society, that it places two of our values against each other. We want to have open and free markets. At the same time, we must realize that aggressive totalitarian dictatorships will abuse that engagement in their efforts to protect themselves from criticism of their atrocities. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party has pushed these Wall Street firms into this scheme because they know that once hundreds of millions of citizens in Western societies are invested in their worst actor companies, they will have a constituency that will protect them from sanctions and other criticisms. They're making us complicit in their crimes. How can an industry, Wall Street and the banking industry, claim to stand for environmental, social, and corporate governance while they're betting their future and our future and your future on a government that is destroying its environment, subjecting its citizens to Orwellian social control, and removing all independent corporate governance that's not controlled by the Chinese Communist Party? For ESG, increasingly, it seems, the G stands for genocide. More than trade imbalances or subsidies or intellectual property theft, the funneling of Western capital into Chinese government companies and into companies that serve authoritarian dictatorships of all kinds represents the biggest transfer of wealth and influence and capital in human history. How did we get into this mess? What will it take for US industry to recognize the risk involved here? How do we get out of it? What is government's responsibility? The first step in fighting this scheme is to expose it. That's what we're here to do today. And I couldn't have a better panel to help me do that. I'd like to introduce Marcos Buscaglia, world-famous economist from Argentina. Did I pronounce your name right?
Very well. Yeah, I lost my bet.
For those who bet on me pronouncing it wrong, sorry. I bet against me pronouncing it wrong, but that's neither here nor there. And Perth Toll, the founder of Life and Liberty Indexes. Let me start with you, Marcos. You know, if Stalin said, the capitalists will sell us the rope we will use to hang them, for China, it seems that we're not only selling them the rope, we're financing their rope company and then handing over our rope technology just for giggles.
Yeah.
How did we get into this mess? And can you describe this scheme and how it works against American and Western investors?
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me. This is a topic that is very dear for me, coming from a country like Argentina. The paradox about China is that, you know, just as Xi Jinping came to power and started to tighten not only tighten autocracy domestically and go against Hong Kong, etc., and everything that we heard in the previous panel, in the previous presentation, but also increasing China's reach abroad. And I would like to talk a little bit about that because money is fungible. So maybe we are financing China's adventures abroad in emerging markets. Just as that was happening, China's financial markets started to open for foreign investors. Before 2013, you could not invest in Chinese stocks or bonds, only on those that were listed in Hong Kong. Starting in 2013, the Chinese government started to open the market, bonds and stocks. First, partially opening them with quotas, then liberally opening them. And the biggest step, and this is something that, an idea that I want to introduce because I think it will be part of the discussion, throughout the discussion, is that the biggest step, in the international investors' increased exposure to China was when financial indices started to include Chinese stocks and bonds in their indices. What are these indices? Well, basically, let's say JP Morgan Emerging Market Bonds Index, right? It's an index that tells you, well, there are these 40 emerging markets. China is, 6% of the index, right? And there are hundreds of funds, right, accessible to retail investors like ETFs or managed by professional institutional investors that track the return compared to that ETF, either tracking it identically or trying to do better than the benchmark, right? So in the bond market, we have the JP Morgan MB index. In May 2021, the Chinese government bonds were included in the biggest bond index, the World Government Bond Index. That means that between 130 billion and 180 billion are being invested as we speak into Chinese government bonds, right? And that's recent. And the same in the equity market. I mean, starting in 2014, 2015, China started to be included in Morgan Stanley's capital investment, MSCI, emerging market indices, right? So now China has 30% of that index. So when you invest your money in an ETF, right, that you can buy with a click of a mouse, right, that tracks the MSCI, it will have 30% of Chinese stocks as we speak.
So what you're saying is pension funds, university endowments, state pension funds, the things that most of us would never directly become involved in, those are increasingly taking on massive amounts of assets connected to the Chinese government and Chinese bad actor companies by following the Wall Street indexes. And the Wall Street indexes are increasing those holdings reportedly because the Chinese Communist Party is pressuring them to do so by dangling market access to these Wall Street firms so that they can make money in China. Have I got that right?
I think that's the right story. I think that's right. But it's not only professional investors. It may be retail investors that, directly through their, account in some investment company, you can access the list of ETF and say, I want to be exposed to emerging markets because a friend of me told me that emerging markets will do very well, their stocks. So you buy, and you're buying this index. You probably don't really know exactly what is going on. Well, let us tell you, it has 30% of Chinese stocks, right? Of the 10 biggest firms in that index, 5 are Chinese firms. Of these firms, 1 is a state-owned company, and 3 of the others, their leadership are part of the CCP, right? That is the same with, there is an analysis that out of the 100 biggest Chinese companies, private companies, 95, their founders or controllers are part of the CCP, and 8 out of the 10 internet companies, they're also part of the CCP. And this doesn't include Huawei because, some people claim that, it's been disguised that the leadership is part of the CCP. So those numbers don't include Huawei.
Not including Huawei.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
well, let me play devil's advocate, Perth. What's wrong with that? Some people will say, especially our billionaire friends from the video, well, aren't authoritarian governments more predictable? Aren't they more stable? Wouldn't you want to invest in something that can't fail because the government owns it? Doesn't that seem like a good investment? At the same time, these companies are obviously producing returns, otherwise these Wall Street firms wouldn't be interested in the first place. Why is that wrong?
Yeah, I'm just going to take a step back here before I answer that question. Sure. We did see the Wall Street titans behind me in the video in the beginning of this kind of justifying investing in totalitarian governments. And that is a narrative that has been the mainstream on Wall Street and will probably continue as Wall Street firms continue to try to gain access to the very potentially lucrative Chinese market. In international investing, there's 3 categories for stocks. So there's and bonds. Developed market, which are markets like the US, Japan, Canada. These are typically pretty free markets in general. Emerging markets, which are like China, Russia, Saudi Arabia. These are markets that are just coming out of autocracies or are still in autocracies. And there's some that are very democratic in this grouping, the emerging markets grouping, like Taiwan, South Korea, Chile, and Poland. They're typically some of the better ones. And then frontier markets, which are the smaller markets like Nigeria, Kuwait, Vietnam. So our firm, we focus on the emerging market space because that is where most of the autocracies are due to the nature of the universe. There's just a lot of autocracies in there, like China. Market capitalization weighting is the scheme that most indexes use. Now, in developed markets, that works just fine. And what market capitalization weighting does is it gives the biggest companies or the biggest markets the biggest weight in the index, which is fine if you have a developed market that's very free and you don't have to worry about those issues. But in the emerging markets, that gives you that 32% weight in China. And by the way, that China weight was 41% in MSCI indices and 45% in FTSE indices in August of 2020 at their height. And now they've gone down to 32 and 30%. And that's due to the China crash, which takes us to your question, why does it matter? Why don't we want to invest in autocracies? So let me take the flip side of that. Freer markets tend to have more sustainable growth instead of this debt-driven, state-mandated growth. They tend to recover faster from drawdowns because they're more flexible to respond to market trends. They tend to have a better allocation of capital, both human capital and economic capital. I grew up in China. I was born in Beijing. I saw the effects of the one-child policy firsthand. That policy changed the culture of my generation, and it has caused tremendous human capital destruction. There are 30 million missing women in China due to the one-child policy. And these are women that are gone from the population due to infanticides and forced abortions. So those types of policies matter for the future of a country and an economy. Now China's dealing with the world's worst demographic situation, and that's not likely to be reversible anytime soon or in our lifetimes. So these policies, matter for investors as well. We see huge shareholder destruction on a massive scale, especially in China recently. Most Chinese indices are down between 40 to 70%, depending on if you're in a broad index, whether you're onshore, offshore, or in a tech index. So So we've seen most recently a large shareholder value destruction in China. The MSCI China Index, which is the ticker MCHI, includes both onshore and offshore shares. Since its inception in 1992, has returned close to 0% for investors. Now, 1992 to now was a huge period of growth for China. China grew because they increased their economic freedom from its abysmal policies under Mao to not so bad policies. And this incremental improvement caused tremendous growth in the country, very real growth. If you look at their GDP from 1992, it looks like this. If you look at the MCHI index since its inception in 92, it looks like this. So it's a very stark contrast in emerging markets that are not very free between what investors can capture and what actually happens in the economy.
So Perth, are you suggesting that authoritarian regimes are in fact not stable over the long run?
I'm suggesting that exactly. So instead of what Larry Fink said on the video, it's the freer markets that are more stable, that have more sustainable growth.
Well, in that case, I have to ask you, why are these Wall Street firms so committed to that idea when the data shows the opposite? Are you suggesting they're not looking out for the best interests of their investors?
I can't speak for Larry Fink, but who holds himself out to be the purveyor of ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance investing
We'll get to
here
that.
in the United States. But yeah, I mean, you can see that Jamie Dimon could call for additional sanctions on Russia, but he couldn't even make a joke about China. JP Morgan's anniversary was on the same day as the Communist Party's anniversary, and Jamie Dimon was at a conference or something in Hong Kong, and he made a joke saying, "Oh, I think we'll outlast the Communist Party." And he learned pretty quick that he had to walk that back and apologize for that and grovel. So we could see that, yeah, Wall Street titans are, they're looking at the China market as a huge opportunity, and that's understandable. Wall Street are here to make money. Nothing wrong with that. But in China, you don't compete for market share. You don't compete by providing your customers with the best service or product. You compete by government favor. And if you're in their favor, then they keep all your other competitors out. So it's a very ideal situation for these Wall Street firms. And they're looking at the huge population in China getting older. It's kind of like when the boomers were retiring in the United States. That was a huge deal for investment representatives here in the United States. So yeah, I mean, it's understandable. Wall Street is greedy, no surprise there. And China is a massive, massive lucrative market. I do think that they are ignoring the autocracy risk, though.
Well, let me bring that back to you, Marcos, because as Perth mentioned, there are some pretty clear alarm bells ringing in China. $3 trillion taken out of their tech industry for nothing other than political reasons. Shutting down of the online gaming industry, the education industry, the real estate collapse, the zero COVID lockdown. It all amounts to what seems to me to be an economic calamity. Yet, as you point out, these indexes haven't reacted to that in the way that you would think. What's going on? Why are the indexes not responding to what seems to most of us as a lot of evidence that this scheme is collapsing?
I think that what happened in the China tech industry and the, how bad the market has done, and also what happened after Russia's invasion to Ukraine, in the sense that investors started to realize, we invested in the Russia's bond market, for instance, because we like stability, like we heard, we like stability. But now we realize, well, maybe there are geopolitical problems. Now, what may happen with Taiwan, right? So the issue here is, I think that what is going on, both the war and what has happened to the China tech industry will, and I hope our, advocacy will help. This panel actually will help bring changes. But supporting what Perth told just now is that I've been focusing personally in my research more on the bond market, because I say I want to track the money that has been directly funding autocrats, from Chavez to Orban, Erdogan, Putin. But in the case of China, there's no such a distinction, in the sense that there's no such thing as private companies. As I said, the leadership of the private companies they are members of the CCP, right? Then, through subsidies and financing. Remember that most of the banks in China are state-owned. So basically, they have a big influence on private companies. And then through regulation, as what happened in the tech industry. What happened in China's tech industry, that doesn't happen, not even in any other emerging market. You have to go, to very low rank, emerging markets to see what happened in China. So there's no such thing as a private company. Then you add to that, demands on controlling data, And at the end of the day, my point here is when you buy a Chinese stocks, you're also financing the CCP. That doesn't happen in countries in which democracy, has been under some attack. Let's say Brazil. I'm from Argentina, my neighbor. Some people question Bolsonaro's, democratic credentials. But private companies in Brazil, they don't work. They're not government entities, right? They're real private companies. So by buying a Brazilian, by having Brazilian stocks in your ETF, you're not financing Bolsonaro. That doesn't apply to China. When you buy a Chinese equity, you are also financing the CCP, and you're also helping undermine democracy.
Yeah, I think he makes a good point there.
Before I go back to you, let me just follow up very quickly. So I'm old enough to remember that during the Trump administration, there was an effort to tackle this problem. And as detailed in my book, Chaos Under Heaven, which is available wherever books are sold. And what the Trump administration tried to do was to stop some of these Wall Street indexes, or more correctly, stop some of these institutional investors like the Thrift Savings Plan and CalPERS from taking on all of this added risk. Of course, the Wall Street firms fought back viciously, and they basically fought to a draw. What do you think is the role for governments, specifically the US government, but any government, in protecting citizens from this scheme that seems to involve both corporate and financial and some government entities?
I think there is a role. There are roles for many stakeholders here. First is through advocacy, try to what I usually say is add D to ESG. We'll talk about ESG, but basically pressuring the financial institutions to take democracy seriously. Second is the index providers, right? The index providers, should add D of democracy to ESG, right?
What does the D stand for?
For democracy, D of democracy to ESG, basically. And then the government, I think, through sanctions also, and regulation can basically help. Let me put a couple of examples from the bond market, which is closest to my research and what I do as a professional. You can still trade Russian bonds in Wall Street. Wow, you can still trade Russian bonds, right? The government is pressuring to take them off the indices, but you can be in a JP Morgan trading desk.
Oh, you get a good price.
Not a good price, but not a good price.
Okay.
That's autocracy. Again, supporting what Per said. Autocracy, at the end of the day, I think doesn't work financially, but you can still trade them. Let me tell you something that happened in Venezuela, for years, right? The government issued a lot of bonds. Wall Street loved those bonds when oil prices were very high. They issued them in a way that allowed for a lot of corruption. In a previous panel, they talk a lot about, the relationship, or yesterday, corruption and human rights. Well, the Chavez administration had all this scheme where he funneled, the bonds to his friends, and the friends sold those bonds in Wall Street. Well, for the friends of Chavez to be able to sell the bonds in New York, the bonds have to be what is called Reg S. That's a US capital markets regulation that allows the bonds to be later traded in the US. You probably will say, well, these bonds are not going to be Reg S, right? So there is a scope for regulators to work, I think, with advocacy groups, with democracy watchers like this foundation, and come up with better regulations that allow a better scrutiny of where your money is going.
Well, that brings, Perth, you can say what you want to say, but let me add this question, because you have an index that weights freedom and democracy and human rights in its selections, presumably to give consumers an option.
So we do have the private market solution for that already. So whatever the government decides their role wants to be, doesn't matter. We provide the private market solution for that, but we'll talk about that in a second. I want to go back to kind of what he said about the China tech companies and the China education companies. What happened last year, because I'm talking to an audience that may not know what happened last year with these companies. First, they disappeared Jack Ma. Once they disappeared Jack Ma, who is the founder of Alibaba, all the tech founders started resigning or donating huge sums of money to the government for common prosperity, one of their new initiatives. How many of you think any of that money went towards common prosperity?
It's a shakedown.
Right. So this is a bribe coming from investor money, basically, from these companies. When we invest in companies like the ones in China or other unfree markets, we are subsidizing the cost of these companies to do business in a way that puts state interests above all other stakeholders, including their customers, including shareholders. So what we want to do as a freedom investor is we want to invest in the companies and countries where they are free to put their own and their shareholders' interests first. So that brings us to our, well, going back to one more thing. Education companies in China. Last year, there was a big push because of the one-child policy and the coming demographic crisis. There was a big push to have 2 children and then 3 children. No one's having more than 1 child because the entire culture of my generation has now changed. So now they're pushing for it. And as part of that, they told all the education companies, which some of these companies are TAL is the ticker, EDU. These are companies that were very, very high growth, stocks and actually good investments for their time. But over a Friday night, at the stroke of a pen, the government said, "You guys are now nonprofits. You are banned from making a profit." If you look up these companies, tickers again, EDU, TAL, you can see exactly on what day that happened. They were going up like this, and then all of a sudden, their value went to zero. There's no chance for that to recover. I believe the New Oriental founder broke down in a shareholder meeting after that. And this is the type of risk that Wall Street has miscalculated up to this point, which brings us to what we do, which is freedom-weighted emerging markets. Instead of market capitalization weighting, we use third-party freedom metrics from think tanks like the Cato Institute and the Fraser Institute to weight countries and invest in the countries that are more free and have more protection for individual freedoms, rule of law, shareholder rights, and stronger institutions. So we believe these are the real safe havens in the emerging markets space. And if you look at our 3-year performance against benchmarks like the MSCI Emerging Markets Index, it does tell that story quite well.
Excellent. I've heard you speak about this before, and I understand that this is a long-term play.
Yes.
And that, we're here gathered today in Oslo because we all believe that the moral arc of the universe does bend toward justice, but it might be a pretty long arc. And I guess what I'm suggesting is, according to one famous economist, in the long run, we're all dead. And what if the Wall Street firms aren't miscalculating? Let me play devil's advocate. What if they know exactly what they're doing and they're steering American institutional and retail investors into these increasingly risky investments on purpose for their own selfish aims? What do we do about that?
So I have a friend who wrote a book about the slave revolt of 1911, which is a very little known about story in history. And he put in his book that, based on his research, some of the slaves in this revolt sided with the plantation owners because they were siding with power. It was a survival tactic. Sometimes I thought maybe, when I was reading that, I thought, well, that reminds me of my colleagues on Wall Street. They're siding with power because they think, hey, this is where the returns are going to be because, Chinese government could just make the stock market go up or whatever it wants to do. Well, we see now that that's actually not the case, that there's a lot of risk associated with authoritarian governments. We see what happened with Russia. And so a lot of people also ask me, well, you have a lot in Taiwan. What if Taiwan gets invaded? First of all, our weight to Taiwan, even though it's our highest weight, is the same as Taiwan's weight in the benchmark indices. So there's no difference there. We also have a cap on securities, which TSMC gets the same weight as well. So, and we believe that the risk lies with the autocracy. As we've seen with the Russia invasion, Russia is the market that got hit the most. And I think the worldwide support for Taiwan would be even more swift and even more coordinated. So the risk lies with the autocracy. I think that if somebody's concerned about that, they should be more concerned about being in an emerging markets index with 32% in China.
Understood. Marcos, China is not Russia. China is about to have the biggest economy in the world. The Chinese economy is integrated into ours in ways that Russia could never imagine. In short, we have a lot more to lose. What lessons can we draw from the massive and sort of unprecedented effort to decouple and divest from the Russian economy? Which ones of those apply to a China scenario, a China-Taiwan contingency scenario, and which ones don't?
Well, that it was too late. That's the first lesson, right? Markets finance Putin, when he was, tightening his grip on power in the early 2000s. So basically, it was too late. But let me tell you other thing, because there is the title of this panel includes ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. And I think that, let me tell you first a very good thing about that. That's a blueprint for what we need to do, in the sense that 20 years ago, nobody talked about, adding standards of, gender equality in boards, of, how companies treated, the environment. And now that has become the norm. There are $30 trillion in assets benchmarked to indices related to ESG now. So it has become the standard in the industry, right? So basically, that's the goal. But our point here is they are insufficiently treating democracy into the indices. And how I do connect this with your question on Russia.
Not at all.
By the time Russia invaded Ukraine, China's weight in the JP Morgan's MB index that corrects for ESG was bigger than the weight,
Russia's weight.
Yeah, was bigger than Russia's weight in the MB index that didn't correct for ESG.
Say that again and explain what that means.
That means that if you invested in a JP Morgan, you track an index, the JP Morgan Emerging Markets Bond Index, that corrects for ESG factors, you have to have a bigger share of your portfolio invested in Russia's government bonds than in the one that didn't correct for ESG factors at the time, on the day of the invasion.
So the lesson is that we need to recognize the risk of betting our future on Chinese companies before they attack, not after they attack.
The broader lesson is that ESG is very good. I think it's getting into something, but for our purpose, that is human rights and democracy, it does not account for human rights and democracy in all its extent, in the sense that, again, it has China, it has Russia. So basically, let me tell you other countries. I mean, Poland was the biggest, sovereign green bond issuer, right, by 2019. Turkey, basically in 2021, set up the standard to issue ESG bonds, right? The ESG community was very happy. We look at what happened in the 10 days after that. There was a political opponent prosecuted, and a political opponent abducted and brought to Turkey from other countries. So my point is, money is fungible, right? And sometimes these ESG indices and the green bonds, which again, they look very good, are used as greenwashing. And money is fungible, and when you are financing an ESG or a green bond of an autocrat, that money, given that it's fungible, may end up financing the police force that is attacking the opposition, right?
Wow. Well,
yeah, so I think that Marcos is saying it in a nicer way than I would.
Say it in the not nice way.
So I think emerging markets, ESG, in the US at least, is a joke. You have no alcohol, no tobacco, no gambling, but genocide is perfectly fine. You have 32% in the non-ESG parent index, and the ESG index, the biggest ESG emerging markets fund in the US, has in its policy statement, we cannot deviate more than 1% from the non-ESG parent index. By definition, that is greenwashing. So you have just as much as...
Sorry, explain that.
You cannot deviate more than 1% from the parent index as far as your allocations. So if the parent index has 32% in China, which it does, the ESG index have between 31 and 33% in China. It cannot deviate more than 1%
So just
from
has
the
the name.
parent
Just
index.
the name is ESG.
It's literally,
It's a cover.
it's
an
a lot
alibi.
of times Wall Street will use terms and certain things that sound complex and logical to cover up for an underlying process that is trying to hide something that they don't maybe want you to see.
Like complicity in a genocide.
Yeah.
Let's take a couple of questions. We have a microphone coming around. I would ask that you just please identify yourself, and if you're going to make a comment, please put it in the form of a question. And could I please have any hands right now? Right there. Please wait for the microphone. We'll be with you in just a moment. Thank you for your patience.
Good afternoon. Oh. Can you hear me? Good
Yes.
afternoon. My name is Eva Khan. I'm here with the nonprofit C4ADS. I have a quick question about terminology. It seems like this conversation has been switching between talking about freedom and authoritarianism in terms of the state that a market is located in and public versus private ownership of the actual companies that an investor is investing in. I was wondering if you could, each of you, I guess, state your preference in terms of where you think foreign investment should be going, whether there's a value in pushing to privatize in markets where there's already significant state ownership and sort of encouraging further private activity, or whether the risk of, say, state seizure of firms that appear private or sort of corruption in firms that appear private under authoritarian regimes means that Western money should move out of those countries and those markets entirely. Thank
Great
you.
question. Who wants to start? Marcus?
I can take that.
My point more generally is that there are some countries in which there are identifiable, an identifiable trend of destruction of democracy. And that when you see that, and the democracy watchers like Freedom House, you know, on real time, they're telling you this is happening. So you have, you have indices to track what is going on, right? With you know, scores and you know, characterizations, free, not free, partially free. You have to stop or reduce your financing to these governments, right? And that Wall Street by its own does not do it now. Let's say we have heard a lot of Belarus. Belarus issued in the last 10 years more than $3 billion of sovereign bonds, of government bonds. These are in the hands of Wall Street and the London City institutional investors. That shouldn't be happening, right? So in the case of private companies, in my opinion, it's more of a gray zone, except for autocracies, like what Perth is doing in her index, right? So again, if you buy a Chinese company, you know, you are at the end of the day financing, you know, the government. So I think you shouldn't do that. Well, so the pressure, in my opinion, more in general, to all these countries should be put on institutions, division of power, you know, and elections and constitutions. That's where the pressure of the Western community should be on.
So on that, we deal in public equities, and we're not here to tell people how to invest. We're just here to make them more aware of the risks and to expose the dictatorship exposures that these emerging markets funds have you in. And we have a exhibit outside that's called Defund Dictators. So one guy came up yesterday and was like, hey, let me look up my emerging markets ETFs in my, what was he using? Betterment account, which is like a robo-advisor. And he looked up the two were VWO and ESGE, a Vanguard Emerging Markets Index Fund, and the US ESG Index Fund that I was just talking about. He had 32% in China between those two funds. So we're just here to make people aware of the risks and that some people aren't aware of in their emerging market indices and index funds. And we have a solution for people who want a freer exposure. Now, I do believe that freer countries will perform better, will outperform autocratic ones. And you know, I do believe it's a better investment thesis. And you know, but more so than that, I do think investors who are in position to direct assets are in a position of power, and we should use that power for good.
So if I'm hearing you both correctly, what you're saying is that we shouldn't completely decouple from every dictatorship and autocracy, but we should have transparency, education, and awareness of the risks involved. Is that correct?
I mean, personally, I would love to decouple from autocracies and not contribute to any of the atrocities that are going on until they become more free. And that's how our index works. But we're not here to tell anybody else what to do. We're just here to provide the solution for people who do want to.
Understood. Marcus?
Well, there is a gray scale, right? And so basically, my point is that democracies are being eroded slowly in the world, right? It's not like you go from being a democratic to being an autocracy in one step, like before, like in the 70s, coup d'etat, right? So basically, my point is that when I study countries like Hungary, Poland, Venezuela, markets have been funding these autocrat wannabes while they were destroying democracy. And at the same time, while democracy watchers like Freedom House were pointing out that that was happening. So that's my point, that we should bring some solutions to at least, again, make people aware that and people means retail investors, like people like you, and Wall Street investors, that shouldn't be happening because we are helping democracies erode slowly. Change the constitution, pack the court, attack the press, and that happens slowly, and then one day you're an autocrat.
Well, now more people are aware thanks to this excellent discussion. Thank you so much. Please give our panelists another round of applause.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this panel where we will be discussing Russia, Ukraine, and the future. You all have heard a lot over the last couple of days about what's happening now in Ukraine, and to some extent what's happening now in Russia. And I thought I would use this really unusual panel. It's a great combination of people with very different experiences to try and throw the story and the conversation forward a little bit. We have one of our panelists you've heard already from, Alexandra Matvichuk, who spoke yesterday. She's a human rights activist from Ukraine who's now very involved also in tracking and understanding and accounting for abuses conducted since the war began. We have Paul Massaro, who's an expert in kleptocracy, in sanctions. He's been worked with and around the US government and the Helsinki Commission, and we'll be able to focus on that aspect of the story. And I would say Garry Kasparov needs no introduction, but I know everybody likes to be introduced. So, so Garry has also appeared here several times. He's the chairman of the Human Rights Foundation, and he's he's had many careers. He's currently one of Russia's best known and most outspoken democracy advocates in the West. So I think we'll introduce you like that today. We'll go through a range of topics. What I wanted to start about was something that, Alexandra, that you and I were talking about just now outside of the room, which was about how one of the phenomenon that's happened in Ukraine in the last 2 months is that a country that has actually been quite historically divided, politically divided, a lot of bitter, bad politics, and in which, as you were saying, people had become less and less involved in public life. People were a little bit turned off by civic engagement. That's now changed because of the war. And you have the phenomenon that we've all seen of really Ukrainians at all levels of society throwing themselves into the conflict and being engaged in it. The question maybe we could start with is this question of how to maintain that engagement and how to think about it after the war, and then how to think about lessons from Ukraine for Russia. But maybe we could start with that.
When Russian large-scale invasion started 3 months ago, maybe the two main emotions is dominated in Ukrainian society. The first emotion is anger, because we so hardly tried to build a democracy in our country. We had 9 years ago revolutionary dignity, and we paid a very high price only for a chance to live and to build in a country where government is accountable, judicial is independent, and police do not beat peaceful student demonstrations. And now our neighbors decided that we have no rights for democratic choices as such, and started to killing us in order to stop on the way of democratic transition. And this is a huge anger. But second emotion, which is more dominated, and now on the first place, I think I can call it love. It's a love to people. It's a love to country. It's a love to our values, freedom and democracy. And now we expected a huge wave of solidarity among all society. I never wish any nation in the world to go through a war. War is something unhuman. But I saw that these dramatic times provide us a chance to express our best features and even to become better than we are. Now we had a chance to understand what it means to be a human beings at all. And ordinary people started to do unordinary things. They literally risked their lives for the other people, which they have never seen before. And this is amazing. And this is like a huge change which fill the whole society, where no one people left indifferent. It's something which Putin is not understand. He thought that he will face only with Ukrainian army forces, and he never thought that he will face with the whole Ukrainian nation. And this is also which is not underestimated by the West, who also thought that Kiev will be occupied in 3 days, but as our Minister of Foreign Affairs today has told that the struggle is lasting already for 3 months. And this is which I explain for myself in this way. Western democracies has for ages, maybe not for ages, but for decades for sure, live with a stable, effective state institutions. And that's why they analyze Ukraine's capacity only for the ability of state institutions to counter these existential threats. And they don't analyze people. But we in Ukraine have never had a luxury to live with a stable, independent state institutions. We are a nation in transit who are fighting to build a stable state institutions. That's why we don't rely upon only on our government. And if something happens like this, the point of crystallization is appeared not only on office of president. The point of crystallizations appeared in hundreds and hundreds times in different fields of Ukrainian society.
And how to carry that forward or maintain it? Is it that is it something that you think will last past this moment of emergency?
I will.
And how to translate it? What's interesting about Ukraine is that Ukraine has actually historically always been really good at creating grassroots movements and from the bottom up movements and civic activism and protest. And it's been less good at creating state institutions that then reflect those kinds of values. So is there something you can imagine happening or would like to see happening in Ukraine going forward that would preserve the values in the form of legal institutions or state institutions?
I will try to rephrase your question and to answer what is the vision of victory for Ukrainian people is. It's not only repeal Russian troops from Ukraine and the occupied Crimea, Donbas, and other territories which are currently under Russian occupations. The victory for Ukrainians means to succeed in democratic transitions. And this is a question, how to provide this huge energy, which now we observe in Ukrainian society, and to make a quantitative jump and to escape of the zone of transition in which Ukraine stuck for decades before revolution of dignity and this war with Russia. And I think that the main answer to the question how to guide this energy is responsibility. And I will provide you my own example. I was a coordinator of civil initiative Euromaidan SOS during the Revolution of Dignity. We brought up several thousands of people to provide legal and other aid to persecuted protesters. And every day, hundreds and hundreds of people who were beaten, arrested, accused in fabricated criminal administrative charge passed through our care. And then later, when our previous president escaped to Russia, we start to monitor the court hearings and the process of investigation of the crimes committed during Euromaidan. And I heard one story which was publicly told in the court, the story of a woman whose son was killed unarmed in the capital, in the main square of Kiev, Roman Gurik, his name. And his mother told that it was a very difficult story. She told that when she found his son dead, and she took his clothes and his bag, he found the rubbish from candies because her son was so polite that he didn't throw this rubbish from candies to the earth. But the main point, what shocked me and stressed me, that she mentioned, as a mother, I don't want to to have my son in Maidan. I'm scared about his destiny and about his security. But I remind to myself that 10 years before, I myself was in Orange Revolution, in the same Maidan Square, and protesting for human dignity and fighting for democracy. And when I heard this, I understand a huge historical responsibility for our generation, because if we will not be able to succeed with democratic transformation, it means that after 10 years or another historical circle, our children have to go to Maidan again and to protest against authoritarian regime. And I think responsibility now driven by Ukrainian people.
Gary, I wonder if you can, having heard that, I wonder if you can reflect on what is needed to make deeper change in Russia. Is there something that you can imagine happening that would lead Russians to have the kind of reaction that Ukrainians are having now, that would instigate civic movement, that would create belief in change? I mean, one of the things that the Putin propaganda is very effective at doing is creating apathy and nihilism. So it's not even just that it creates enemies and tells lies, it also makes people not believe in anything. And therefore, including the future and including their own ability to effect change. What does that make you think about the path to creating a safer and different Russia?
Answering this question is hard to avoid going back to the 90s and to think about missed opportunities, because we had an equal start with Ukraine and other former Soviet republics, and I spent a lot of time thinking, how did it go wrong? Mm-hmm. So we had this celebration in August 1991 with this August Revolution and toppling the statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky. Though I think it was a mistake. We had to burn down KGB building. That's the. And it's just telling anyone on those days that in less than 9 years, KGB lieutenant colonel would be the president of Russia. I think it would be inconceivable. But I think the problem is that, while Ukraine also struggling with her own problems, or other countries for Soviet Union, they try to find their own path. And I'm not here to make comments about some dictatorships, and this is what's happened in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Republic of Georgia, but concentrating on Russia and Ukraine. So Russia never. We tried to do the tribunal on Communist Party, but it was a joke. It didn't work out. But most important, we never tried to understand the true nature of Russian state. It's actually that transcends communism. It's an imperial matrix. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was not touched. And that's why we, even under Yeltsin, we already had first signs of the future problems, like Russia's interference in Transnistria or in the North Caucasus. There were too many problems there. Under Yeltsin, we thought we could probably handle them. But then the Chechen War came. And I think it's important that is what's happened in 1994, that is, while Russia started this first Chechen War, trying to subdue Chechnya, and that was a big scarf on nascent Russian democracy. Ukraine had a historic moment which now I understand separated Ukrainians from Russians. There were people born in 1994, people born in the same country, Soviet Union, on two sides of the imaginary border, if we cared about this administrative border, Kharkiv, Belgorod, 100 kilometers, spoke the same language. But in 1994, Ukrainians had a peaceful transit of power. Leonid Kravchuk lost elections and walked away. Mm-hmm. This is the fundamental thing that actually just changes everything. And that's exactly what we missed in Russia. So while Ukrainians accepted, again, I'm not here to make comments on Kuchma, Ukrainians realized they were in charge of their government. Mm-hmm. We, the people, In Russia, we saw first attempt to save Yeltsin, and I have to admit, I was terrified by return communists. I thought anything that could help Yeltsin to survive is good. But it was something very, very different. And I think in these years, 93, 94, up to 96, we lost this chance. And what's happening now, it's a result after a quarter of a century. So we have one country with a very vibrant civil movement because they had twice they have been told to pick up someone they didn't like. And both times the response was Maidan. And I think the current conflict is inevitable because Putin regime, I'm not sure that the nihilism and Putin being what I call a merchant of doubt, it's the way they spread propaganda in Russia. That's more for foreign menu. But inside Russia, since 2014, Putin building this imperial consensus. And while I applaud those Russians who tried to protest, but what we saw, tens of thousands, maybe a couple of 100,000 people on the streets, 16,000 were arrested, but still, it's not enough for a country of more than 140 million people. And even more tragic, there's still, the considerable number of Russians, my compatriots, who could use VPN, who could use all the tools at their disposal to find out what's happened in Bucha, in Kramatorsk, in other places. Yeah, they know what's happening, and they don't want to know about it. So I think somehow they try to shield themselves because recognizing the crimes committed on our behalf, war crimes on an industrial scale, requires you to throw yourself into the fight. And unfortunately, our traditions of civil society, they are no longer there.
So the vector of change in Russia has to be anti-imperialism, or an understanding that the empire
Absolutely.
has failed.
If Russia has any future, it must eradicate imperial virus from its body. And it means we have to reconsider, not only the history of the criminal communist regime, but what's happened before. We have to look hard at what happened in our history and say, okay, it's a choice to be made. And does Russia belong to Europe? We still have traditions going back 600-700 years ago of Novgorod and Pskov Republic. So, by the way, Kiev's Rus is also part of this ancient Rus. So, do we want to go there, or we want to be, to remain Golden Horde? So
the job of the Russian opposition now, which includes people both in and out of the country, should be that. I
think it's the only chance for us to survive. Otherwise, the military defeat, which I believe is inevitable, in Ukraine will lead to the collapse of the regime and, as we know, the collapse of dictatorship, like Putin's, will inevitably lead to the collapse of the whole system. Same as in the Soviet Union. But I think it's in 1991, what we had was more like 1918 in Germany. Yes, Soviet Union lost the Cold War. But it's as in 1918 in Germany, it was lost somewhere else. You didn't see the physical defeat. So yes, some armies were lost the battles, but people didn't feel it. And that's why there was a myth that brought Hitler to power. Oh, it's traitors, they betrayed us. Same happened here. This is Gorbachev betrayed us, Yeltsin betrayed us, and then you had Putin. Then you had Putin rising, very similar. Now we're going through 1945. God forbid, without bombs dropped on Moscow. But this kind of defeat, unfortunately, is needed for the country to recognize that what Putin offered, this is imperial road, is a dead end or abyss.
Paul, your expertise is in corruption, international corruption. Can you talk about the role that has played in both Ukraine and Russia in the past in shoring up autocracy or in undermining democracy? And then maybe we can all move on to thinking about what the outside world can do to fix that and other things.
Yeah, for sure. And thanks, Anne. A hard act to follow here with these two great human rights defenders. And I should preface all this by saying these are my personal views. These do not represent the views of the U.S. government necessarily. I look at the past sort of 10, 15 years or so, at least since Putin's Munich speech or since the invasion of Georgia, as kind of the failure of deterrence. The West should have prevented this war. We really should have been able to prevent this war. And we didn't. And the question is why? You know, I mean, we had many, many opportunities. Why didn't we respond in 2008? Why didn't we do what we're doing now in 2014? That's when this war really began. That was the first invasion of Ukraine. And then it went on for 8 years, and we still didn't respond. And then there was Interpol abuse, and we didn't respond. There were assassinations in the UK, and we didn't respond. There were cyber attacks, and we didn't respond. Election interference. So what's going on here? And that's strategic corruption. Elite capture was Putin's strategy toward the West. That is, strategically get these individuals that maybe they're lawyers, influential media figures, politicians, lobbyists, and so on and so forth, people that could essentially ensure, not that the West necessarily did what Russia wanted, or pursued a pro-Russia policy, but that the West did nothing. That was the really critical thing, was that the West not respond. And this was just unbelievably successful. Over and over and over again, and I mean, everybody kind of knows the names now. Gerhard Schroeder just stepped down, but there was Karen Kneissl also just stepped down in Austria, Francois Fillon. There are many, of course, in the UK with oligarch money in the UK. Switzerland is absolutely loaded with oligarch money and so on and so forth. And, you know, we had made significant progress, I think, in the last year and a half. But if you asked me in January, were we winning? I would say no, and I think you would agree with me, Ann, because that's when you wrote your piece where you said, we're losing. Decisively, you said, we're losing. And I think that that's right. I think we were losing. I think that strategic corruption was winning, and we were not moving fast enough. But then Putin invaded Ukraine, and I actually think Putin understood the West. I think Putin got it right, in fact. I think Putin could have taken Kiev if not for the Ukrainian people being what the Ukrainian people are, and for Zelensky being the leader of the moment. I mean, remember, you know, I hate to put it this way, but we were ready to lose. We came in and we offered Zelensky evacuation. Nobody thought Ukraine would survive. Putin didn't think Ukraine would survive. Putin understood the West, but he didn't understand Ukraine. He didn't understand Ukraine. So I think that part of the problem is, because you asked me to talk about the Ukrainian corruption, Putin has also pushed, now Ukraine has a corruption problem, that's definitely true, and we've tried to address that, but Ukraine, Putin's wanted Ukraine to be viewed as just this basket case, irresolvable basket case of corruption, and you know, you can't trust whatever. And I think that actually seeped into the Western mindset in the sense of, oh, Ukraine is, you know, irresolvably corrupt and is, you know, will never be able to defend itself and all this kind of stuff. And then everyone was just shocked. And what happened is we were forced to look at ourselves in the mirror. And it's all because of Ukraine that there's any Western unity now. We would have accepted this. You know, we would have just accepted it. You know, we would have accepted Medvedchuk in Kiev and so on and so forth. We didn't. So now we have sanctions, now we have Western unity, now we have the end of Nord Stream 2, which we'd been calling for, you know, for ages and so on and so forth. Many different policies that we've been working on for many, many different years. Now suddenly policy, because of Ukrainian bravery. And now the question is, can the West hold on to this?
Well, so I'm going to ask you a different version of what I asked Alexandra, which is how do we kind of institutionalize or ensure that something about this moment lasts? I mean, because you're right, we do have an unusual moment of Western agreement. We have even a degree of bipartisanship in the United States, which is amazing. You know, we don't agree about anything except for that we all like Zelensky. And how do we use this moment and the lessons of this moment to translate into thinking about perhaps a different security architecture? One of the focuses of this conference, rightly, is individuals and their stories and the heroic things that they do to fight back against political systems, but all of those stories happen within, you know, a bigger geopolitical climate. And the geopolitical climate for the last certainly the last decade, maybe longer, depending on how you count, has been a slow decline in the international respect for human rights, a rise in the impunity offered to dictators and to autocrats, a rise in the degree to which autocrats work together to help one another, and a declining solidarity among democracies and among democracy activists. And this is really an interesting moment when suddenly people in Washington and Brussels and other places, I mean Tokyo and Canberra, have woken up and seen that this is a this is a moment of crisis. But how do we maintain that and keep it going? Why don't you answer first, and then I'll ask the same question of the others.
Sure. So I mean, the old security architecture, the post-Cold War security architecture, is over whether we like it or not. Now there are certainly those I think. Some European Schultz and Macron come to mind, who would like to see a return to business as usual, who would like this to be a flash in the pan and go back to what we had before. But to be honest, the last 10 years, this has been dissolving anyway. This is just the nail in the coffin in one sense that ended that architecture. And now we need to recognize, take this moment to recognize that we need a brand new architecture and do it. And this really needs to look like democracies and autocracies, as I think you've called it the Autocracy Inc. or the Thug International or whatever. We need to come together as democracies and say, okay, well, enough's enough.
And can you be at all concrete about what that looks like? What are we talking about?
So one of the really, I think, brilliant things that has happened in response to this crisis has been the coordination of the G7+1. And I think that we need to recognize what the tools are that we have, like finance, like sanctions, that are very powerful. And then look at that coordination. Eventually, this is still kind of ad hoc cooperation among democracies, but we could see an institutionalization of these structures. And in all honesty, we need to start building democracy-based transnational, international structures on top of the international architecture that includes everybody, because that international architecture is just so infiltrated by these autocracies and so turned to them and their purposes. Either that, or again, all they have to do is make sure that they do not function. I could name any number of organizations, I'm sure we're all familiar with them, that are totally inactive. Where are they in this crisis? The UN, the OSCE, so many different organizations that are nowhere to be found in Ukraine.
So I interviewed Zelensky a few weeks ago in Kiev, and one of the things we asked him was, do you have anything to say about the UN? And he wouldn't answer, he just made a kind of face. It was like, he just rolled his eyes, and he just said no comments. But Alexandra, you and I were talking earlier about security architecture. It is a thing that people talk about in Kiev in a way that they don't talk about almost anywhere else. What do you understand? I mean, particularly from your perspective as a longtime human rights activist and lawyer, what needs to change? What about the current system doesn't work anymore? How could we change it going forward? What should we be advocating for?
I wish I know the simple answer, but I haven't. I spent 20 years struggling for human rights, and 8 years from this 20, I provide documentation of war crimes, because this war started not in February this year. The war started in 2014, when Russia occupied Crimea and started hybrid war in the Donbass. And my focus was testimonies of people who become abducted and tortured. Some of them were tortured to death. I spoke more than hundreds of people who survived from captivity, and it was very difficult stories. They told me how they were beaten, raped, how their fingers were cut, how they were smashed into wooden boxes, how they were tortured with electricity. One woman told me how her eyes were pulled out with a spoon and other things. And for 8 years, I used all existent international instruments to stop this horror in occupied part of Donbass and Crimea, and I failed. And now, in this crisis, which provoked by war, I mean human rights crisis, because Russians use war crimes as a method of warfare, and we have numerous victims of human rights violations. I couldn't go and to wave with Hague or Geneva Convention and stop Russian tanks with it. And even the whole my understanding and knowing of UN and Council of Europe, OSCE system, couldn't provide me any chance to release one single person from captivity. And I'm a human rights lawyer who once again spent 20 years with working such instrument as a law, now found myself in a position when I spoke with politicians and they asked me what Ukraine needs, and I answer weapons. And it's not normal. We need now weapons to survive, but it's not normal to live in a world where you couldn't rely upon international organizations, where you couldn't rely upon an international system of peace and security because it's lay in ruins like Mariupol. It's a very dangerous world to live, when you could rely upon only on weapons and your military potential, it's very isolated and very dangerous world which have no predictability, which can only rule of law system provides. And the first problem, which I recognize by myself from a lot of conversations and interactions with UN system, Council of Europe system, OSCE system during these months, this is that they don't recognize this problem. They said, Russia is bad, and we have no opportunity to interfere. Okay, Putin's regime is awful, but Putin's regime did these things in the world where they can do these things. This is a world which can provide opportunity for Putin to invade Ukraine and to make atrocities in Bucha. Something wrong with the world itself, not only with Russia. And UN, Council of Europe, OSCE, has to recognize this problem. If we want to change Russia, we have to speak not about only strategy, how we have to change Russia, it's important. But we have also to put on the table a question how we have to change international system of peace and security. And it's not only a Ukrainian question. It's important for all people in the world, because we live in a very interconnected world, and only spread of the idea of freedom made our world safer.
Gary, I didn't have to ask. I know that you agree with these. I know that you agree with these sentiments. Is there a way that we could begin thinking differently? Obviously, after this war, going back to some OSCE kind of peace monitoring, which is simply observational and has no enforcement mechanism. Obviously, a return to a world in which the UN has to take its hands off because Russia's a member of the Security Council. A world in which China and other autocracies increasingly have a big role inside the UN in determining, even shaping the language that the UN uses when it talks about these things. Obviously, that doesn't work. So what should we be pushing towards? Which way should we go? How do we think differently about these international organizations?
When I talked about the future of Russia, I said it's the only chance for my country to find its place in the 21st century. It's to reinvent herself, to eradicate imperial virus for its body. Now, when we talk about international security, I have a simple question. Are we talking about lip service, doing a makeup, or rebuilding it? Because it doesn't exist. It exists on paper. Every war, you look at history, and every major war ended up with some sort of an arrangement to prepare conditions for lasting peace. All the way back to 1648, after 30 Years' War in Europe, and then after Napoleonic Wars, and then after World War I. Okay, League of Nations didn't work. That's why we had World War II. 1945, we had United Nations. What was the purpose? Is basically to prevent nuclear war between superpowers in World War III. It was like a big freezer. In 1991, the Cold War was over. What we did? Nothing. We relied on institutions that were not built to solve problems. How do we expect them to solve problems? What did Zelensky did on UN? Okay, he was polite. Because what do you expect from an organization? That is it's a catwalk for dictators. It's this, it's a piece of paper. Russia is a member of Security Council, but General Assembly, we have 2/3 of the population now living in unfree world, and they're being represented there. If we're serious, and if we want to make sure that the tragedies that we are now seeing in Ukraine not going to happen, and by the way, it's not all Ukraine, we can go beyond that. We could see there's so many hot spots on the map that could actually blow up as well. That's why victory in Ukraine is important, not just to save Ukraine, to restore territorial integrity, and to destroy Putin's war machine, but to send message to every potential aggressor, dictator, thug, whether he's sitting in Beijing or elsewhere. And that's why we have to learn from this experience. And that's what late Senator John McCain called League of Democracies. I don't want an organization where you have countries paying this lip service to human rights. I want us to get together. We are strong. First time in human history, free world has overwhelming advantage, militarily, economically, politically, whatever, everything. The whole world depends on free people. From China, we got virus. From America, we got vaccine. That's it. That's all we have to know about the future. So, Ukraine is a sample, how to deal with aggressor. And that should give us an idea how to build these institutions, to make sure that Xi Jinping will not be thinking of attacking Taiwan. So every other dictator in the world will recognize that's it. You will be cut. We can, yes, we have to suffer, yes, I understand. We have to pay, yeah, but it's any money cannot compensate for blood being spilled. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think we have now all the lessons we learned, hopefully we learned. We missed this point in 1991. We didn't press Russia, and even to look at the crimes of the communism. We decided, okay, we can just, let's get rich. What was the most popular book in 1992, best-selling book? The End of History. History does not end, and the evil does not die. It can be buried under the rubble of Berlin Wall for a while. But the moment we lose our vigilance, the moment we become complacent, it sprouts out. So I think it's, again, Ukrainian war must be a lesson that will help us to build real institutions, international institutions, based on values, supported by our military strengths. What's wrong with that? And to demonstrate that the entire power of the free world will secure international borders and all the international agreements that are being signed. We're not going to force regime change in China or elsewhere, but they have to know that there are limits. They cross these limits, they will have the full wrath of the free world, economic, political, and if necessary, military.
You're speaking my language, man.
Your language, but not your organization. I know. You're
speaking my personal views.
So this is now the sort of final thing to think about for all three of you. So what has to change in Washington, in Brussels, in London, in Paris, in Kiev, even in Moscow, in order for a different, maybe not Moscow, we'll leave them out for the moment until they become a democracy too, but in order for a different thinking about security architecture to arise, which would offer not just assurances to countries like Ukraine, but guarantees, which would think about democracies as being something that needs to be defended and that will periodically have to be defended. How does one go about changing the mentality that we have today? Maybe you could start thinking about that, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thought process has begun. I mean, I think that it's really accelerated thanks to Ukraine's resistance. And I mean, it's all because of Ukraine's resistance that this has been made possible. I mean, I think that in the short term, the most important thing is to set actual victory goals in Ukraine, as Alexandra laid out, that are complete victory, that are, total liberation of Ukraine. I think it's also important to recognize that, we need to be comfortable with isolating dictators for a long period of time. There's always this, essentially there's this push and pull of forces, right? There's this, I guess, the us, and then the other camp that's always saying, oh, well, we need to bring everybody back into the wide umbrella, bring everyone back into the fold. And there's always, it's about resisting that temptation. It's about becoming comfortable with the isolation. It's about, one of the things that's happening, again, some of this is a little bit more subtle, but the Secretary of the Treasury recently endorsed friend-shoring of supply chains. So there's a lot of this private sector stuff that we have to organize such that vulnerable supply chains and that sort of thing are all out of authoritarian countries. So
begin to think differently, even economically.
Economically, first and foremost, because the reason for our failure was economic. The reason for our failure was taking corrupt money. It was relying too heavily on the Chinese market. It was our elites getting cushy retirement jobs for Russian oligarchs and so on and so forth. Or Putin himself. So I mean, all of these things, all this global economic reordering, the political will move alongside of that. But only if the economic reordering happens is the political possible.
Mm-hmm. Alexandra, your concluding thoughts, and then I'll ask for Gary's. So on this subject, how do we begin to change mentalities to prepare people to think differently about democracy and autocracy?
Several days ago, if I'm not mistaken, the New York Times made editorial op-ed, and they very slightly told that Ukraine has to be prepared to the tough compromises. So they push Ukraine to give up of some territories. And they silent in this article about terror, which Russians organize on the occupied territories, and they maybe have no idea that in this war we are fighting not only for our territories, but for the people who live in these territories also, and for our values, which they people inheritance from the previous struggles. So I think that if we want to find the difficult answers to difficult questions, the current politician elite and civil societies as well has to take responsibility for the solving problem. Not like advise Ukraine to give up from some territories and make some compromise with Putin, but to face with a huge challenge how to stop Putin, how to stop this war in Europe, how to prevent any further war to appear, which can be inspired by Putin's examples. And I see that current politicians are not be able for such kind of thinking. They think very narrow electoral periods. They are mostly worried about the future of their political forces, but not the future of the planet. And they have like temptation that the problem will vanish sooner or later. But the truth is that problem will not vanish. And if they advise Ukraine to repeat the history lesson from München, what's happened with Hitler, everybody knows the story. It's not a solution, neither for Ukraine, not for the whole world. So responsibility and understanding that we couldn't rely upon on the previous vision of the world, because after 2014, the previous world is not exist anymore. We are in new age, in new era, in new circumstances, and we have to take responsibility to be effective in this new context.
Gary.
We all in agreement here, but I just make one correction. Paul said, so this is we owe the current moment, so the revelation, the moment of truth to Ukrainian resistance. Yes, to Ukrainian resistance, bravery, heroism, but on top of that, and most of all, for Ukrainian sacrifice. This is the word that has disappeared from dictionary of the free world. And this must come back. We have to be ready to make sacrifices. One of the problems now is, embargo on oil and gas. We have to sacrifice too much. Oh, it costs money. Oh, business with China. We cannot do that. So this. We live in a world where dictators could silence not only opposition inside the countries, but they could silence organization in America, like Chinese Communist Party silenced NBA, that is afraid to open their mouths because 15% of their profit comes from China. Going back to what I said, we represent free world that has overwhelming political, financial, economic, and military advantage. We need to rise. Yes, Chinese market is big. American market is bigger. And if all these companies, all these Nikes in this world, will hear voice of free people, if they have to choose, they will make a right choice, the only choice they can make. And that will be the signal. We should send this message to all dictators in the world that now learned to be comfortable from Putin, from Xi Jinping, from other dictators, that the free world is corrupt. You call it strategic corruption. For Putin to export Russian corruption, he needed those who were willing to import it.
Absolutely.
So let's make sure it doesn't happen. Let's make sure we put values before profit. Because at the end of the day, that's it. That's the future of our world is on stake.
2 minutes left. Each one of you give one piece of advice to the audience. What can they do in their organization or in their country to help make this change? Alexandra.
I will say that I spent several months in Kiev when Russian troops tried to circle our city, and we have no idea what will be tomorrow. And now it's a huge privilege for me to be with you. And I'm really grateful for all support which I get here. I understand it's not support for my personal, it's support for the whole Ukrainian people. And I would like to tell you a huge thank you for your warmth and for your solidarity. And one things which I know from my own experience, that I know that a lot of people in this audience not working for human rights and freedom. You are fighting for human rights and freedom every day. And you face sometimes with the whole state machine. And sometimes other people think that our fight have no sense at all because our opponent is so strong and so solid. But I know from my own experience that we have to continue our fight honestly, and result sooner or later will be achieved. Thank you.
Paul, briefly.
Yeah, so at the Helsinki Commission, I've had the privilege to work with Kyle Parker, who's actually here today in the audience. He's our chief of staff, and he was the architect behind the Magnitsky Act, which I think is familiar to everybody here. One of the very first efforts to sort of hold Russia to account in a serious way, the abuses of the Russian regime, the Putin regime. And he taught me, I think, the most handy piece of advice for moving legislation, and that's make it about a story, make it about somebody. Don't focus on trends and patterns, don't focus on statistics and data, make it a story. And I think that that's really something that's worked for me and has worked for many others. So,
Gary, last word.
I know, as you know, I used to be a chess player, and I always knew that.
I didn't mention that at the beginning.
Yes, okay, yeah,
that's
why I want to mention that. And I knew the difference between strategy and tactics. I think on strategy we agree, so we understand what is to be done. But no strategy can succeed without perfect tactical implementation. And it's not in math. You cannot, just shift numbers. It's about precise moves. And the future of our world depends on the battle in Ukraine. So that's why the one thing I want you to do, just do whatever is in your power, whatever you can find to donate, to send, to help Ukraine win.
On that note, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
dette går bra, vi åpner i morgen.
Ja.
Det var jo samme dagen, så hadde vi bestemt i løpet av natten, og det er han høyeste lederen som var for presidenten av meg, som var forestående med meg. Så for de jentene som er gift med ferdig land.
Hva sa du?
Det er her jeg så, og det var jo, så han, ingen kan på meg som fremdeles en litt sånn,
Jeg skal bare komme en slags.
Så her så burde vi jo bare arbeide snart. Vi har jo lov i stedet. Men det var liksom det som skjedde, og etter det så var det veldig mye som var ikke sant, kvinner kanskje reiser igjen. Så da kom det veldig mange som vi er tilbake der. Nå er det veldig
Er du ganske alene der nå?
Ja, det er jeg. Men det er jo selvfølgelig, det er jo noen av de samme tingene som er i Ukraina.
Victor!
Det er jo også tydelig å melde seg på meg, vi er nå i Ukraina. Det er jo noen av de samme journalistene.
Jeg skulle si litt sånn ondskapsfullt, men at Afghanistan nå sånn at om 10 år skal vi skrive boken om hvordan vi kommer til å glemme Afghanistan. Det er jo selvfølgelig nå, da. Nå er oppmerksomheten på seg videre.
Vi gjør det faktisk. Eller som også bare sa liksom at liksom det der 94-96 for de store feilene ble gjort i Russland, hvor vi følger med, hvor de også går i militaristisk retning, men hvor vi også etter liksom en og 90 var ferdig. Egentlig passe på liksom litt ferdig samtidig vi litt først i Palestina. Ja, nei, så det er jo ingen som følger med det. Men altså, all respekt for den norske Afghanistan-komiteen, svenske Afghanistan-komiteen, en del av de som er akkurat helt inne som det var før, mens de fleste amerikanske hjelpeorganisasjoner, altså education, altså alt bare det er også faktisk et problem med denne krigen, som jeg tenker det er veldig mye som ikke blir diskutert, fordi det er komplisert, men man har 850 000 av de mest som kunne investert i landet, så har man på de som er igjen, altså alle de det går utover, de som på en måte, den som ikke var organisert, vi sørger for så for eksempel tyske og franske hjelpeorganisasjoner, som nå sitter i asylmottak, som kanskje var nestkommanderende, var både eksperter eller
var det i stor grad basert på, altså en ting er det sånn, altså jeg vet ikke hvor god de analysene er, altså hvor, jo, men også rett og slett sånn, hvor mange skal vi se som diskuterer, fordi de har samarbeidet.
Ja, det er klart det er lett å si i etterkant, for det skjedde ikke. Taliban var jo allerede nyttårsdagen, amnesti for alle, bortsett fra de som kom opp av og dette er jo en fremforhandlet også løsning mellom Taliban, så gikk det jo langt raskere fordi motstykket Zelenskyj så dro av Sjaklani, og det de sto der og bare sånn, ja, nå er jo, da tar alle politiene av uniformene militært, og da er det lovløst, da ville det bare blitt som det var i ferdig i Bagdad. Det var jo noen tider hvor det er ingen mulighet her. Så de gir amnesti, og så kan man stole litt på dem, men det har ikke vært noe til, i hvert fall ikke noe systematisk, man går ut til arbeidere, og sant, man har ikke sant, man tror det er nå, man ser det som folk. Han er ikke sånn veldig åpen på det, men han...
Har du kikket i systemet som apparatet sånn, eller snakker du ikke med dem?
Altså, jeg følger ingen sånn organmandan som er i det lokale nettverket, altså, men han er jo leder på militærsiden, og som er på en måte det er veldig sånn
Okay.
As a moderator, how do you do this?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
You better explain that I'm not doing it. After a while, maybe we'll come to it later.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the myth of efficient dictatorship.
Stand by. Hello, everyone. Please take your seats. Welcome to the myth of efficient dictatorships. Just a bit of a change to our speakers on stage. Michaela Wrong has graciously stepped in for David Himbara, who could not be with us in Oslo, and is unfortunately in a location where there's not great electricity supply, so he didn't want to take a chance of zooming in and then cutting out. So on this panel, we want to shine a light on two countries where freedom of expression has been stricken in deference to dictatorship. And countries like the United States, the EU, that would normally be fighting to defend democracy in these states, have chosen instead to look the other way, arguing privately to reporters like me that, look, these might be strong men running these countries, Rwanda and Kazakhstan, but they brought a certain measure of stability and economic progress in otherwise dark areas of the world. Now, I am here with two experts to explain to us the human cost of that in suffering and lives lost, and ultimately in economic progress and stability. So, joining me, Michaela Wrong, who has written a book that you can get out in the HRF bookstore, Do Not Disturb, the story of a political murder and an African regime gone bad. And independent journalist Joanna Lillis, she has written her book, Dark Shadows, from her time reporting 17 years and counting in Kazakhstan. And I've got to hear how you're able to write something, a book like that, and keep reporting there. But let's start with, you've each seen it go horribly wrong in a personal way. You've lived it. Now, Joanna, can you start us off and tell us about what happened in January, the political chaos that only really ended when Russian troops came in, and what has come out of that?
Yeah, thank you, Kim, for the question. In Kazakhstan, what happened in January in Kazakhstan? Well, I'd like to start by saying that we have an awful lot of questions still 5 months on about what happened in January in Kazakhstan. What happened was what the Kazakhs have come to call Kandy Kantar. That means bloody January. And it was exceedingly bloody. What began as peaceful protests were in some cases hijacked by violent elements, but were also violently dispersed. And the death toll from those horrible few days is 270 people. 19 of those are members of the security forces. The others are civilians. And in that death toll is official, but it does not include the 8 people who died from injuries sustained during torture in detention centers. So what happened? I think in order to talk about what happened in January and how these protests began, I think we're probably going to have to backtrack about 30 years. What happened in January to me was an implosion of Kazakhstan, a country that I love very much, and an implosion that actually exploded this myth of efficient dictatorships. Because, you know, what I have noticed in our part of the world, in Central Asia, is that the authoritarian leaders love to talk about how well they run their countries for their people. They don't ask the people what they want, as I'm sure many people in all parts of the world are familiar with this style of rule, but they love to talk about stability. Now, stability has been a buzzword for Kazakhstan for 30 years. That's the amount of time it's been independent, 31 this year. And it was ruled by one man for 30 years, Nursultan Nazarbayev. He created a monocracy and a kleptocracy. And all of this has been really bubbled to the surface over the last, I would say, 3 years. Because 3 years ago, the man who ruled Kazakhstan for 30 years with an increasingly iron fist resigned. Now, why did he resign? To secure his own legacy in his lifetime and to continue that much vaunted stability that he liked to talk about so very, very much. Stability, or what we're talking about, the myth of efficiency, but I also like always to talk about the myth of stability in Central Asia. We've had many warning signs about violence that could erupt in Kazakhstan. We have had ethnic violence occasionally, but in 2011, so a full 11 years before this violence erupted in January, we saw violence in a town called Zhangozhen, where striking oil workers ended up gunned down by the security forces.
Striking because of lack of pay, or because everything we hear about Kazakhstan is it's oil-rich, and you can see that in the glittering skyscrapers and the monuments that Nazarbayev has made partly to himself.
Indeed, and indeed, in fact, it's exactly the kind of grievances over those glitzy buildings and the way people live in the capital, which incidentally these days is called Nur-Sultan, after the first president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, who created a great cult of personality with statues, roads, books, the stage plays, films, etc. But these oil workers were extremely resentful about the fact that they do the work that powers Kazakhstan's economy, and yet they feel they don't reap the benefits. They live in a very drab town, and the conditions were even worse at that time. Many people in Kazakhstan live in extremely poor conditions. It's an oil-rich country with, as you said, this glitzy capital with these edifices that are absolutely extraordinary. But people feel resentful. In villages, many people don't have running water. And in these kind of inequities, economic inequities, boiled over again in January, when people began to express their grievances about all kinds of political injustices, their lack of political voice, and the economic inequities, which mean that in Kazakhstan, according to KPMG, the consultancy, international consultancy, 55% of the wealth owned by 162 people. Wow. That is 0.001% of the population, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
Right.
And if the population isn't aware of those specific figures, they at least know that there are very few haves, and the majority of them are in the have-nots.
Indeed. And so what we've seen is a myth of political stability and economic prosperity on which Nazarbayev founded his own myth, if you like, his own cult of personality. He would specifically promise political stability, economic prosperity, but of course the economy begins to founder, the stability is skin deep, it's a castle built on sand, as we saw in January, and the people have been showing how fed up they are, in fact. Since Nazarbayev resigned in 2019, when they began to take to the streets. And they had a slogan, we have a choice, because Nazarbayev foisted upon them his protege, his successor, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, to whom he has bequeathed a system that is clearly not fit for purpose, despite this much-wanted efficiency and stability. So Kassym-Jomart Tokayev has inherited this system, which was built by Nazarbayev for Nazarbayev, and not surprisingly, it's not working. So what we also saw in January was all kinds of rogue elements,
hijacking genuine protests?
Hijacking what started out as genuine protests, and I'd just like to add as well, those protests began in that very same town I was just talking about, where oil workers were shot dead in 2011 and then spread very rapidly all over Kazakhstan. And Nazarbayev, as I said, resigned 3 years ago, but interestingly, the protesters' slogan is one that they've been using for several years, and it is, in Kazakh, it's shalket, and it means old man out, old man go. And it means that they did not feel that he'd gone, even though he resigned, and that the whole system remained, and then it all exploded into violence. Now, I'd also like to point out that 270 dead, as I mentioned, plus 8 tortured to death. Who were these people? Well, the fact is that although, of course, we know many of their names because their relatives have gone public, the fact is that we don't know exactly who these people are because the government has, after 5 months, still not published a list of the dead, which I think is a mark of extreme disrespect to the dead and to their bereaved relatives.
Just one more sign of a lack of transparency.
Indeed,
indeed. And of course, then the new president is using this incident back in January to clip the old president's wings of some of his behind-the-scenes power, and he used Russian troops to enforce his rule, which can't be a good signal to the people, but it seems to have worked.
Well, indeed. I mean, now it's certainly true that the first president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, is most likely about to lose all the special privileges he had in the constitution, which include protection from criticism, immunity from prosecution, immunity over property acquired for him and his relatives. But there will be a constitutional referendum in Kazakhstan in about 10 days, and
a free and fair election?
Well, the people are being strongly encouraged to vote yes. And of course, Kazakhstan is a country that's never had a free and fair election in all its 30 years, one that's been deemed so by credible international observers. And as for the Russian troops, indeed, now Tokayev invited troops from the Collective Security Treaty Organization to quell what he said was an attempted coup d'etat. Now, the implication seems to be that perhaps relatives of Nazarbayev were fomenting trouble because they feared what happens after Nazarbayev leaves the scene altogether. But now Nazarbayev's wings will be clipped, but all these problems remain, and there's no clarity, there's no accountability so far. The government promises transparency, justice, and so on. Many people have not been brought to trial. I've interviewed people who were dragged from their hospital beds and taken to detention centers and tortured. They were gunshot wound victims, and the implication being that if you got shot, you must be a suspect, or you must be guilty of something.
Heaven forbid if you were just walking by and got caught a stray round.
Quite, and some people did.
So that sounds like, you know, an oil-rich mafioso, I don't know, drama. So from that, we pivot to Michaela. Earlier in the forum, you were talking to Karine Kanimba about the jailing of her father, Paul Rusesabagina, of Hotel Rwanda fame. But it was the murder of another dissident that turned what you knew about the Paul Kagame regime on its head. Can you tell us?
I start my book talking about the murder of Patrick Karegeya, who is Rwanda's former head of external intelligence, who at the beginning of my book is strangled to death when he is lured by a friend up to a hotel room in South Africa, in the Michelangelo Hotel. And, you know, by every indication that he was killed there by a death squad sent in 2014 by Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, to take out his former head of intelligence. The man had fled abroad, set up an opposition party, and denounced Kagame as a dictator. But really, that was just a pivotal moment. But there's been a whole track record, and one that journalists like myself were very aware of, but often didn't want to fully digest or vocalize, which is that assassination has been a theme with the Rwandan, with Paul Kagame's regime. Back in the 1990s, you were already seeing Hutu interior minister who had fled to Nairobi, who was killed in a second attempt. He was shot dead in his car. Seth Sendashonga, very famous man, a very respected politician. And there have been a series, since Patrick Karegeya was killed in South Africa, there have actually been a series of high-profile assassinations in places where all the indications are that Rwanda is reaching out outside its own territory to take out dissidents and political enemies in Mozambique, for example, again, repeatedly in South Africa. And researching the book, what I discovered is that there was this sort of more and more evidence of this being a tactic used by the Rwandans, and that Kagame was using it in particular to focus on members of his own military elite who had fallen out with him and thought of him as a dictator. So, yeah.
I'm wondering, had these various opponents, had they threatened violence against him, or was this simply political opposition?
I think what you see is these people stand up to him inside Rwanda, criticize him, or show that they're not happy with the status quo, question his authority, question his decisions, and then, in the case of Patrick Karegeya, end up being jailed several times, and then are warned, usually by members of the elite, other generals, you know, you better leave town because you're gonna be killed. So they flee, and at that stage, you know, they set up opposition parties, and then, you know, there is a track record in the region of going into armed opposition in neighboring Congo. So I think that's been the trend. But I think that's not surprising because you're dealing with a system where there is no real political opposition in Rwanda worth speaking of. Someone reminded me here today earlier that there's a opposition leader called Victoire Ingabire who would have liked to have been here today. She wrote to me and said, please tell people in Oslo that I would really like to be there, but I am not allowed to leave my own country. She spent eight years, I believe it was, in jail. She tried to run against Kagame in elections, and like several of the female candidates who have tried to stand against Kagame. This is very ironic because Rwanda is often hailed as a great bastion of feminist political power. She ended up in jail and is now under house arrest in Kigali. So opposition per se is kind of meaningless in Rwanda.
So how did it go from, you know, Paul Kagame was initially seen as the man who would bring stability to a country that had been riven by genocide. He was going to bring economic stability as well. Millions, possibly billions, poured in terms of aid. How did he go from the great hope to this nightmarish, thin-skinned dictator who brooks no political opposition whatsoever?
Well, if you were a more skeptical person than I am, you would say that nothing's changed and that those elements were always there from the get-go. I do think there's more and more evidence emerging that the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which was Paul Kagame's, you know, the rebel movement that invaded Rwanda, took control of Rwanda in 1994, had certainly got a lot more blood on its hands than people realized at the time. Journalists went covering those events, but there was this track record of ethnic cleansing. I do think, though, that the regime has bared its teeth in recent years. It's become much more intolerant of dissent. You know, the elections have been more obviously rigged. In the last elections, Kagame won 99% of the vote. The press has become increasingly muzzled, with people who set up vaguely, you know, gently critical newspapers have ended up in jail, or they've been killed, or they flee abroad, they flee to the West and seek political asylum. So I think if you look at the track record of these kind of regimes, they become more and more intolerant of dissent as time goes by. And one of the reasons is exactly what I was just describing, that the people who used to rein Kagame in, his former spy chief, his former ambassador to the US, his former chef de cabinet, his former solicitor general, who would probably have said, is that really necessary? Do you really need to crack down on the opposition quite so overtly? Why don't you let these journalists air their views? They don't really threaten you. I think they all have fallen out with the regime. They're in jail, or they fled abroad, or they've been killed. And so, of necessity, these regimes become more extreme and more overt in their repression.
So, of course, another pattern in these dictatorships is that the dictatorship uses the resources of the country to enrich itself more than its people. Yet, this corruption can occasionally lead to horrific events that the public can't ignore. In Kazakhstan, we had a situation that killed a bunch of children. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this was a terrible, terrible tragedy. I'll just backtrack a second. When I knew it was very important to write about corruption in my book, Dark Shadows, but I couldn't find, for a while, I couldn't think, just listing all this corruption, this stolen money, the property owned by the president's family and cronies, it's very dry. But then I recalled, of course, this tragic case when corruption that is so pervasive in Kazakhstan that it pervades not just the oligarchs and the way that they do business and the way that they steal from the people, but it pervades, ordinary life, and it has terrible impact on ordinary life. And in this case, in 2006, it was discovered that 150 children had been infected with HIV in a southern city called Shymkent I think it was in basically one hospital. And it was really down to corruption because of reusing syringes to, save money, demanding money from parents to use.
Syringe.
And so this was, this impacted these families, still does now. And they
So I misspoke. Then the children were infected by HIV, which can be a certain death sentence if you don't have the proper, sometimes very expensive drugs to take.
Indeed, and now it. Some of them did die, but the government does provide them with antiretroviral drugs free of charge until they're 18, certainly. So the government did take some responsibility for this for this tragedy. But it was to me very much about how, even in Kazakhstan, people are talking a lot more about corruption, partly thanks to some of the groundbreaking exposés that some brave journalists are doing in Kazakhstan. Some of them are in the room today. But I think people have a real tendency to shrug their shoulders and say, oh, it's just the way that things are done here, what can you do? But, and they think, maybe they're thinking about the president's relatives and their villas
But are you saying there's a system where, Afghans used to complain to me that the new government that the U.S. had brought to their country was corrupt from head to toe. That in order to get a driver's license, there were several different people that you would have to bribe. All these levels of people within the judiciary, et cetera, where they said, look, at least the Taliban didn't make us do that. Which was, a pretty hard thing for me to hear, or General H.R. McMaster was in charge of rooting corruption out of the country and kind of concluded at the end that, it was so baked in, he had no idea how to remove it. So is it like that in Kazakhstan? To get a normal service, to get, I don't know, your property taxes paid or something, do you have to bakshish people along the way, as the expression goes?
Well, I would say not. It's not. I would say it's not at that level. In fact, in Kazakhstan they set up a special system, e-government system, to try and remove the human factor, to try and remove some of that. So, not at that level, I would say, but it's absolutely pervasive in the healthcare system, where nurses and doctors are paid so little that they demand bribes for the routine treatment that should be free. It's pervasive in the education system. Now that has terrible implications. I mean, do you want people buying their degrees if they're going to be nurses, doctors, build bridges, civil engineers? And also, it's absolutely pervasive in the judiciary. And, to me, this is, I think, reform of the judiciary in these dictatorships, in these authoritarian regimes. We probably don't talk enough about how complicit the judiciary is in all of this. Now, corruption's one element of it, but it's also, in Kazakhstan, I think I'll go back to Bloody January, we just see this constant assumption that people are guilty if they got arrested. There's a sort of, although in principle there's an innocent till proven guilty principle in the Kazakh judicial system, it's a very post-Soviet system inherited from the Soviet Union, and although it's been reformed, there is what's called accusatory bias in courts, where the judges are really working with the prosecutors to get everybody convicted. A very high conviction rate. I think it's the acquittal rate is less than 1%.
Wow. So you just said some pretty strong things about the Kazakh judicial system. Are you worried when you go back that you might be targeted by it? Have you been targeted before in doing your job?
Well, you have to remember about the Kazakh regime that it's quite savvy. And so it should be, because they've spent absolutely millions on Western PR companies. I mean, Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, was notorious for being an advisor to Nazarbayev. He's no longer. But now the government harasses and intimidates Kazakh journalists non-stop, independent ones, critical ones, but they do tend to be more tolerant of international journalists, especially, I think, especially when we're reporting in English or another language, and it's not affecting public opinion in the country so much.
Wow. Michaela, how about you? Have you ever been targeted or feared for your life for doing your job?
I won't be going back to Rwanda, that's for sure.
And I see the Rwandan trolls really like you.
Yeah, the Rwandan operate a very effective army of trolls, and I would not feel safe. I don't think I would get media accreditation anyway, but Rwanda's a place where people are always looking over their shoulders, and they know they're being watched, followed. And if you're a journalist and you're working somewhere like Rwanda, you're a Western journalist, you've got to be aware also of the impact you have on the people you meet. So someone like me who's written a controversial book about Rwanda, if I ever were to get media accreditation, I don't think I would be actually sort of causing trouble and problems for anyone I went to interview. And that's not a situation you want to.
Did you hear that from any of your sources when you were doing the job there?
Did
any of your sources, when you were interviewing them, did they get intimidated later?
Not when I was there, but I mean, one of the problems writing my book is how many of my sources had to be kept anonymous because they would only talk to me on absolute strict conditions that I never sort of give the slightest clue who they were. And obviously that affects the credibility of what you report. And it was also often quite difficult to meet up with them, because, you know, we were discussing earlier the use of the Pegasus spyware that the Rwandan government uses, that is sold by that Israeli company NSO. People are very aware that their emails are not to be trusted, that they may be, that my communication system may be being monitored by the Rwandan state. So even people won't answer emails, they won't respond to you, and they will only say things to you if they meet you in person. So you have to sort of make a huge effort to go out and see them. So all of those are really big problems for a journalist if you're trying to establish the validity of something you know.
And of course, for those who might have missed it earlier, when you spoke to Corinne Kanimba, she revealed that Citizen Lab had checked out her cell phones and found that there was that Pegasus spyware on her phone, and she found it on her phone last year too.
Yes.
So at least we have circumstantial evidence that the Rwandan administration, which has targeted her publicly, rhetorically, seems to also be spying on her.
I think the evidence is overwhelming, and I thought what was really striking was that when the investigation into Pegasus was done last year, it actually revealed that the Rwandan government is systematically bugging the phone calls of the Ugandan, Congolese, Burundian, and South African military and civilian leadership, including the phones of Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa himself, when he was discussing normalization of relations with Rwanda after a diplomatic spat. So what it means is even diplomats, when they will be very careful about using their phone, discussing Rwandan matters, meeting journalists like me, it really becomes a very suspicious environment in which to operate.
And of course, that serves the regime because the more people fear talking, the less the story gets out. But that tension has to go somewhere. Yet we still have the NBA did a major sports event within the past couple of years.
Yeah, well, there was a very interesting session earlier here at the conference into sports washing. And I think regimes are very clever about the way they use the sports industry to win themselves kudos abroad. It's in the soccer field, Paris Saint-Germain, Arsenal, with Rwanda, bicycling championships, volleyball. There are a whole range of areas which Rwanda is very, very clever at using so that it wins a positive image in the West. And I think this is all part of the myth of the efficient dictatorship. Of presenting itself as a friendly place, a place that's known for its gorillas, for its rolling hills, and a place that you go and you visit the memorial sites and you're reminded about this terrible history of genocide, which makes you, of course, much more sympathetic to the government, which is portrayed as a movement that ended the genocide. And in the process of sort of going there, visiting memorial sites, then going to visit the gorillas, maybe sort of going on a cycling trip, seeing the safari park, you're not going to be looking for the underlying issues such as the fact that there's no free press, the fact that Rwandans can't vote in elections, the fact that opposition people are fleeing the country, the paranoia that you might just get a sense of, and this sort of obsessive tidiness and cleanliness that is very much part of the Rwandan look. There is a lot of this is a very cosmetic look of cleanliness, a sort of Germanic focus on these kind of details that impress Westerners above all when they go and visit Kigali.
How many of the people who live there believe it?
Who live there, I think it is simply impossible to know, because one of the things that you're never going to establish is what public opinion is in Rwanda. Who is going to tell a man with a clipboard going around a village what they really think of President Paul Kagame? Or they're certainly not going to tell a Rwandan official that, and I very much doubt that they would ever tell a Western person with a clipboard. So I think that's one of the great mysteries. It would be really interesting. I don't deny that Paul Kagame might well win elections that were freely and fairly conducted in Rwanda, because people have been through such terrible trauma, in 1994 with the genocide, and what followed was similarly turbulent, that they might well vote for President Kagame and the RPF, but I just don't think we're going to know. We won't be allowed to find out.
And yet he doesn't have the confidence in his own people to let them vote.
I think 99% election rates in Rwanda aren't even just an issue of lack of trust. They're an issue of macho pride. I think it is considered to be what Kagame is due. He is referred to as a fande, the boss.
So you're saying that his elections are always reported as 99% in favor of him? Whereas I think Nazarbayev at least
they're in the 90s polls,
okay.
And I don't think anyone who really understands how elections work believes those are credible numbers. But it's seen, I think, by the people around Kagame as what he deserves. And therefore, it's sort of irrelevant what happens at the polling booth.
So, arguably in Kazakhstan, people who called Nazarbayev the father of the country are pleased with one element of his administration, the way he was able to bring so many ethnic Kazakhs back to the country. So can you describe a little bit of that? Is that one positive part of his rule, or are there problems with that too?
Unfortunately, there are problems with that too, but it is a very interesting program that was dreamt up after independence in Kazakhstan. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Kazakhstan was unique among the 15 republics that became independent countries, in that its titular people, the Kazakhs in this case, were actually in a minority in their own country. They were less than 50% of the population. Now, this was very much the result of an extremely traumatic history for Kazakhstan. I mean, especially we can point to the 1930s when Joseph Stalin was in charge of the Soviet Union and inflicted not only the terror on the people, but also, in the case of the Kazakhs, just like the Ukrainians, in fact, a terrible famine caused by driving, in the case of Kazakhstan, driving the nomadic herders who had a perfectly sustainable life on this often barren steppe that makes up a lot of Kazakhstan, but driving them into collective farms, requisitioning their meat. At least 1 million Kazakhs died, another million are believed to have fled abroad, some of who later came back. The Kazakhs were also driven into a minority in the 1930s and in the 40s when Stalin would take entire peoples and just deport them to Kazakhstan as a collective punishment for, in case they supported the Nazis or he believed they supported the Nazis. Well, of course, this brings us to mind, unfortunately, Ukraine today with Putin and his fascism. But the result of all this, this kind of demographic havoc was wreaked on Kazakhstan. And as I say, in 91, they were a minority in their own country. Now, of course, it was the country of everybody who was born there. And they included large Russian minority and also other peoples like Ukrainians, Uzbeks, Tatars, Tajiks, etc. Over 100 different peoples, ethnicities. Now, Nazarbayev's answer to this kind of demographic conundrum that he inherited was in a way ingenious, and it was to tell all Kazakhs who were scattered abroad that they could come and live in Kazakhstan, and there would be different kinds of perks which have varied over the years, sometimes financial, fast-track passports, help with starting businesses, this kind of thing. And actually, over these 30 years, 1 million Kazakhs have come from other countries to live in Kazakhstan. Now, some of them have come from nearby countries, Russia, for example, or countries with Uzbekistan, many of them from Uzbekistan, countries with similar sort of cultures, post-Soviet, familiar, and also maybe linguistically as well, often knowing Russian as well as Kazakh. Some of the Kazakhs have come from countries like China, Iran, Mongolia, and sometimes they've had a lot more difficulty settling in because they're not familiar. It's been a shock sometimes, maybe the nature of modern day life in Kazakh cities, say, not familiar to herders from Mongolia, for example. But also, interesting, of course, in this context is that many Kazakhs have come from China. And now the Kazakhs, alongside, we've heard a lot.
And a lot of them are Sunni Muslim. Most of them are Sunni Muslims.
Yes.
So they're in a part of China where Islam is, the worship of the Muslim faith is not permitted.
Exactly, and neither is, in fact, the pursuit of any kind of minority lifestyle, as far as we know. And from what we've heard from the excellent speakers we've had from the Uyghur community here at the Oslo Freedom Forum, and the Kazakhs are being targeted in exactly the same way in China. They've been imprisoned in re-education camps. I'm trying to remember the expression that was used, but I don't like that expression because it's a terrible euphemism. They're actually concentration camps. And now many of the Kazakhs are facing the same fates as their Uyghur brethren, which is that now that China has kind of, by force of public opinion, more or less closed the camps, or at least it says the people have graduated, but many of these people are now being given very long prison terms.
And yet I've heard from Kazakh officials that they tread softly on this because if you criticize China, China reacts badly. They're trying to work behind the scenes on this to, again, bring them all together. Because now the country's population is 2/3 Kazakh, which is an achievement, or no?
Well, if we return to that point, yes. On the officials, yes. I mean, the government comes under fire from people in Kazakhstan and from people outside Kazakhstan for not doing enough to help the Kazakhs of Xinjiang. Now, of course, most of those Kazakhs are Chinese citizens, so it's obviously awkward, difficult, and the might of China and whatever power Kazakhstan has got are incomparable, obviously. But the government does say it does what it can behind the scenes, but it doesn't criticize China for its treatment of the Kazakhs publicly. When we go back to that demographic question where we sort of started, yes, the result of this program, which was previously known as the Warolman program, that means returnee, even though most of these Kazakhs never set foot in Kazakhstan before. And these days, it's called, the government has told people to call it the Kandas program, means kind of blood relation, so it sounds positive. But the result of this has been this and other things, including birth rates, higher birth rates among Kazakhs than the Russian minority, and migration of the Russian minority to Russia, especially in the 90s, but in droves. But the result of this has been that, yeah, nowadays about nearly 70% of the population is Kazakh and about 18% Russian, whereas it was almost half and half, 40% at independence. Now, the national security implications of this are, of course, very much to the fore now that Russia has invaded Ukraine. I mean, we have been hearing similarities.
That 20% or 18% that includes a large Russian-speaking population is a risk. But of course, the Russians have the cosmonaut dome in Kazakhstan, so they have a bit of a relationship.
They have a close relationship, and a close, but shall we say, very tense now. I mean, maybe not publicly, but Kazakhstan. We've heard here at the Oslo Freedom Forum people saying that you can't be neutral over the Ukraine war. Well, Kazakhstan's official stance is that it's neutral, but it has withstood pressure, for example, what we assume must be pressure from Russia, although neither side has said so, to recognize the breakaway territories of Luhansk and Donetsk that have broken away from Ukraine with Russian backing. Obviously, the President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, talks often to Putin, and I believe, talks often to Putin, but he's also taken calls from Zelensky, which is kind of, I mean, from the Kazakh point of view, that looks a bit like sticking your neck out, especially because people have talked since 2014 when Putin annexed Crimea and fomented separatism in Ukraine. People have been talking about Kazakhstan as the next Ukraine. Long border, 7,600 kilometers, large Russian-speaking minority that Putin likes to use as pretext. And we hear a lot of rhetoric, and we have done. In fact, for 30 years we have, but especially since 2014, Russian nationalists always staking claims on northern Kazakhstan. So it's an alarming situation for Kazakhstan.
So I just want to give the audience a heads up. We're about to pivot to questions, but I had one more question. We have a microphone right here. If you have a question, for instance, about Rwanda and you don't want to identify yourself, we understand. Just give us your question. So the microphone's right there, if you could walk up to it. So I had, Michaela, as we wait for folks to walk to the mic, my question for you was that economy question about the economic mirage in Rwanda.
I mean, I think it's very interesting because the West, it's very important for the West to see Rwanda, where it spends a lot of aid goes to Rwanda, to see it as a developmental success story. And I would never suggest that Rwanda hasn't put quite a lot of its aid to very good use. But again, it boils down to these very clean streets and flower beds. I ended up feeling that the measure of a dictatorship is how marvelous its flower beds are, because those in Asmara are beautiful, and so are those in Kigali. As I was writing my book, if you look at all these amazing statistics that you see presented for Rwanda,
alleged rates of growth.
Yeah, these sort of incredible growth rates, poverty alleviation, a supposed green revolution. When you examine them, and there are more and more reports now coming out, they just don't stand up to scrutiny. The Green Revolution, it turns out, was 15 years of stagnation. There's been a recent report by a young German researcher in SOAS. There are more and more studies. Often they're anonymously written because the academics are so worried about being challenging the consensus on the Rwandan success story, showing that there's actually been growth in poverty, not poverty alleviation. I think the doing ease of business ranking, which is very important for Rwanda, it had an incredible, amazing high ranking. Supposedly it was as easy to invest in Rwanda as it was in the Czech Republic. They've actually, the World Bank has withdrawn that ranking, not because of Rwanda, but because it was discredited around the world. So I think you pick away at these numbers and you end up thinking this is really not as impressive as we were told. And that's very important because if you've got a place where the human rights record doesn't stack up and people have been saying, listen, it's not a democracy, but the economy is so impressive, the development record is so impressive, then if it turns out the development record is not miraculous, it's just quite good, that's a real challenge to developmental thinking.
Yeah, what is your excuse for looking the other way, human rights abuses? Can you come up to the microphone? Or okay, introduce yourself if you like, or just give us your question, whichever you prefer.
Hello, my name is Camille Runginya. I'm coming from Belgium. And I'm here in behalf of Mrs. Victoire Ingabire Muhoza, who is in Rwanda, who was invited and who couldn't come. And because of the regime, of course. And my question was, I don't know if you're aware of the conferences of the Commonwealth who will take place in Rwanda in June, I think. And I was wondering what you think about the Commonwealth organizing such conferences in that kind of dictatorship.
Yeah, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting is happening in Rwanda in June, and I would certainly have counseled against that. That meeting was put off for 2 years because of COVID, so there were 2 years in which the Commonwealth could have chosen a different venue, and I think it would have been a good idea if it had. There was a study done when Rwanda joined the Commonwealth in which the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative examined Rwanda's track record for governance and found that it didn't meet the criteria for joining the Commonwealth in terms of good governance, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, transparency of elections. And I don't think that those conditions have changed. I see this huge amount of propaganda for the Commonwealth meeting coming up. It's on Twitter all the time. The government is really milking that. I do hope that when that meeting takes place in Kigali, that the people who attend it, the government officials from the Commonwealth, will make a real effort to meet people like Victoire Ingabire, to meet the few journalists that managed to operate inside Rwanda, to meet people from the really severely repressed civil society, such as it is, because if they don't, they are betraying the mandate of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth has a charter. All its members sign up for it. It's a charter that holds it to very high standards of good governance and all these democratic values we've been talking about. And if they don't make an effort to reach out to those groups and reach out to those individuals and allow them to express their views on what's happening in Rwanda today, then they've betrayed the Commonwealth.
So you're saying basically use this spotlight to put Rwanda's regime under a microscope.
Absolutely, because there'll be lots of talk by those government officials. Prince Charles is going to be there, and they're going to be talking up Rwanda, talking up its economic and developmental achievements. So, it is incumbent on the Commonwealth to give those people within Rwanda who don't ever get their views expressed in the local media or don't ever manage even to leave the country when they want to. It should be listening to what they have to say as well.
Next question. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Muzaffar Suleimanov. I represent civil rights defenders in Stockholm. And, well, first of all, thank you for the panel, for the information, and thank you.
Sorry, I apologize. My hearing's terrible. Can you speak a little bit more directly?
Yes, thank you for the panel. Thank you for reminding the world that the year started with January in Kazakhstan, the bloody events, because Kazakhstan disappeared from the headlines already. And the question is to Joanna about censorship in Kazakhstan. We have seen that there was a blockade. The government completely shut down internet. You got stuck outside of the country. You couldn't go to Kazakhstan to report. And, well, we have seen that the government can do that. Now comes February, sanctions against Russia. We see the talk that among the sanctions, there should be a blockade of internet in Russia, which means that Central Asia is going to be blocked as well. And we also know that Kazakh government is reviewing a bill on imposing some kind of blocks on social media right now under the premises of blocking the bullying of kids. So the question is, to what extent should we in the human rights community be worrying, and how should we be prepared to the fact that, well, if there's going to be a repetition of this blockade, how should we act, how it's going to affect the entire region? Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. That's a very good question. Yeah, and it's something we haven't raised, is how the Kazakh government simply pulled the plug on the internet and all telecommunications in most of the country, or at least parts of it, swathes of it. And certainly in Almaty, the city where I live, I was stuck outside, as Mustafa mentioned, and unable to get in.
Unable to get in because?
Well, first my flight was cancelled, and then I flew to Kyrgyzstan and was not permitted to cross the border because it was closed.
Because you were a foreign journalist?
No, it was closed to everybody. Usually foreign journalists can cross the borders when they're closed, but on this occasion they refused outright. So that's an infringement of press freedom already, because, you know, you need to be there. So I was stuck very close to Kazakhstan, but not in it. So yeah, but this internet, this was this was such an ambitious. That's the wrong word because it sounds positive, but this was the Kazakh government was using the tools it has refined over many years to control not just the internet, but also all the telecommunications were down for a while, so that people couldn't communicate. And we heard at a side event on Central Asian media this morning about how that led to rumor spreading, and it didn't really, in some ways, it didn't benefit the government itself. I mean, it created situations that put people in danger. For example, I interviewed a man whose parents were shot in their car, killed as they drove around because they hadn't realized how serious the situation was, which may sound crazy to us now, but the fact is that if there's no internet, no telecommunications, how would they know?
Was the government filling in the void with state media saying there was a curfew or anything?
Yes, yes, television. But of course, a lot of people don't have television at all. I mean, but yeah, they were using the television and some text messaging that was reaching some people and not others. So, you know, and I think this is a very good question. I mean, I think it should be impressed on the government that that's not an acceptable way to behave. It also frightened people.
But as you laid out rather graphically, Kazakhstan is stuck between a bunch of big neighbors, China, Russia, that has a stranglehold on it, and Russia has been making moves towards creating its own internal internet that's cut off from the global internet. So it's not exactly a positive example that's going to pressure them in any way. So then who pressures Kazakhstan to be more tolerant of dissent?
Well, in this case, it'll have to be the West. I mean, because who else will do it? Who else will do it? It should be impressed upon President Tokayev that it's in his own interest. And that, I mean, in that context, I think the West should be...
By the West, do you mean the United States, the EU, bodies at the UN? I mean, who has levers of power or influence on the Kazakh government from your
Well, I mean, I would personally argue that the West's influence has been waning in Central Asia for a long time, where Russia remains the dominant power, in my opinion, certainly politically, and of course China very dominant economically. But I mean, Western governments, I suppose, above all, should be talking to the Kazakh government behind the scenes and impressing upon them. The Kazakh government is very, and Tokayev himself is a former Deputy Secretary General of the UN in Geneva. He knows what the international system is, and it should be impressed upon him that it's in his own interest not to keep his own people in the dark so they get killed. And also, while we're on the topic, because we don't have much time left, I mentioned very briefly that there will be a constitutional referendum in about 10 days, where about a third of the constitution is being changed. And Tokayev is very insistent that this is political liberalization. But, I think the West should be impressing upon him that it's fine, change the constitution, say you're having political liberalization, but he talked about political competition when he came to power. Like Rwanda, there are no functioning opposition parties in Kazakhstan. Opposition leaders have been driven out, also killed, and so on. But what is going to matter is that he actually lets them register, not puts on paper how many signatures, he's cutting it down and so on.
And if he doesn't do that, then he risks being spoken of on more panels like this and compared to Paul Kagame.
He does, and he also risks another bloody January.
Yeah. Last question.
You hear me? Yeah. Cristina Borelli from Venezuela. And a couple of things that you said rang bells, and that's tourism. What do you recommend with regard to tourism? Because we're starting to see this in our country, Venezuela, which is a narco dictatorship, and they're seeing that tourism is an easy way of promoting themselves as the efficient dictatorship. And it's a touchy subject because obviously you want to give local people alternatives and to do tourism and so forth is, that's a worthy economic activity, but at the same time, it's helping the dictatorship. So what are your thoughts on tourism?
So,
yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Yeah. I've written about Eritrea in the past, and I always used to encourage people to go to Eritrea because firstly, it's one of the safest, police states are very safe places. And, Eritrea is fantastically safe for years and years. You could walk around at 2 a.m. in the morning as a woman and you'd be absolutely fine going through the capital city. And I also thought it was important that people got to know Eritrea and saw Eritrea because most people didn't even know where it was, and it's, had fabulous sort of things to offer, Art Deco, and they would then come back and be interested in Eritrea. And given that Eritrea is a huge source of illegal immigration into Britain at the moment, that was very important. With Rwanda, I find myself slightly more torn because I think the government is really using tourism to project this developmental miracle story, just as it's using the Commonwealth Summit. And then in the meantime, you're always, if you're a VIP turning up to Rwanda, and if you're a normal tourist, you will feel obliged to go and visit the memorial site, and you'll be sold there this narrative that's very self-serving, which ignores the fact that so many of Kagame's opponents and dissidents now are coming from within his own Tutsi minority, and you'll be sold this story of a beleaguered government surrounded by enemies in the Hutu majority, bravely standing up for this the Tutsi minority, and I think it's a dishonest narrative. So I'm reluctant to encourage people to go there and then buy into that. And partly because I go and I give talks. I was in South Africa recently, and there were quite a lot of people in the audience. When they were asked who's been to Rwanda, about 15 people in a smallish room, probably a smaller audience than this, put their hands up, and they'd all gone to see the gorillas. And they all had come back thinking that Rwanda was fantastic and it was so clean. I mean, it's funny how that cleanliness thing and the flower beds keeps coming back. And you sort of end up thinking this tourism really is is part of the problem.
And Kazakhstan, would you recommend people go?
Well, I personally would think that there are benefits to people going, seeing what it's like, and also there are benefits to the people who live there of meeting foreigners and talking to them. And so I would, yes, because also, of course, tourism is not such a big thing for the Kazakh economy, which is oil-rich and so on, as it is for Rwanda, so it's not enabling the regime in the same way either. But I would definitely encourage people to go so that Kazakhs can meet them.
So in the last minute, I give you each 30 seconds to say, how does the dictatorship end? How does it end in Rwanda?
That's a big question to spring at the end. What I say when people ask me that is I say, look at the history of the Great Lakes, and you will see how unpredictable it has been in the last 20 years, 30 years, how many presidents have left the scene in very abrupt and often violent circumstances. So I cite that as my reason for not giving any predictions. I mean, this is a part of the world that remains extremely unpredictable, and that's why we have to kind of keep engaged with it, watching it, commenting on it, because who knows what can happen.
And Kazakhstan?
Well, we're already seeing how the dictatorship ended. The Nazarbayev dictatorship ended with this bloody January violence, 230 people dead, plus 8 tortured to death. And I think what that should tell us is that dictatorships tend not to end well. What I would say about Kazakhstan is this gives a window of opportunity. President Tokayev keeps talking about his reforms, but if he doesn't, he also says he's creating a listening state. He's been saying that for 3 years, so long before bloody January. He needs to listen to the people. He needs to satisfy their demands for a political voice. And then, then it won't end badly if that happens.
Let's hope. And on that somewhat hopeful note, I want to say thank you to the Oslo Freedom Forum for sponsoring this conversation. Thank you very much for taking part.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, so when they're close, we get in.
The coup d'etat one? Started swiping. And she found a date. She found a date.
I'm picking up washing machine.
Skrur du på den mikken I senter?
If you can just leave it back there, I'm going to go. Yeah, I'll put it if it works. Hi, everyone. Just wanted to let you know the last session of the day will start in about 10 minutes. Thank you very much. We'll get started shortly.
si avvikling noe med
sit in the couch?
Chair or the couch?
Whatever you want, buddy.
You can have the chair. I'll go couch.
I could squeeze in there. You want me to sit in the middle?
That would be a little tight.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session on Bitcoin, the environment, and human rights. I'm Troy Cross. I'm a professor of philosophy and humanities at Reed College, and also a fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute. I'll tell you my story first, and then I'll introduce the panel. I started getting interested in Bitcoin in 2011. I was fascinated by the idea of a money that was not controlled by a state and would disintermediate a predatory and rent-seeking industry. And I started mining this cryptocurrency in my basement with some machines that I had. And I was excited about the community, the possibility, the idea. I'm a philosopher. I thought this was one of the most beautiful ideas I had ever encountered. An idea that spun into a valuable reality and promised to bring the kinds of liberty and freedom to people that we have seen here at this event. Then I did a back of the envelope calculation on the energy use of Bitcoin mining, so-called. This is in 2011. And my very quick calculation predicted sort of the end of everything if Bitcoin were ever to reach the market cap of gold. And so I stopped mining and donated my machines to a local nonprofit. And I followed Bitcoin because I loved the idea. I loved the idea of disintermediating financial institutions and having money that was outside the realm of the state. But I was always conflicted about it as an environmentalist and as someone who thought it would consume roughly all of the energy in the world in order to operate. Now, years later, I actually came across the work of some of our panelists, Nick Carter and Lynn Alden. Sorry, Darren, I didn't come across your work. All right. It made me think more deeply and revisit my back-of-the-envelope math and return to the Bitcoin community. And I actually kind of think that Bitcoin on net could be an environmental benefit rather than a cost. But I don't have to explain that to you because I have the people who got me to rethink my position right here, and I'll introduce them. Lynn Alden describes herself as an analyst, but really that covers a great variety. A former electrical engineer with a background in aviation, who has written prolifically on not only Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, but macroeconomy. Nick Carter, whose articles, I guess, first really intrigued me, is a partner at Castle Island Ventures and also co-founder of Coinmetrics, and has written extensively on the question of Bitcoin mining, proof of work, and emissions. Darren Feinstein is a co-founder of the largest blockchain infrastructure company in the world, Core Scientific. And Darren has recently taken to Twitter and written on the virtues of proof of work. So I'd like us to start out, since this sounds fairly technical, proof of work, with just an explanation of what Bitcoin is and how it forms a consensus. It's a distributed ledger, but these ledgers all get coordinated somehow through the expenditure of energy. Darren, do you want to explain what this mechanism is and why it matters?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for your story. I think that that you've hit the nail right on the head. The description and the education around this network is really to explain to people what proof of work is, why it's important, and why that's an innovation in and of itself. You have lots of very intelligent people globally that look at this network and they're very confused on the value of it. Why is this valuable? And like Troy, myself, in 2011, when I looked at this network, and my background is I was an accountant and I'm a lawyer, and when I looked at this network in 2011, I saw on the internet that people used Bitcoins to buy drugs and that it potentially used a lot of energy, and it sounded like digital video game money to me. So I dismissed it like Troy did at some point in his time with the network as well. And lots of people do that initially. It turns out that a few months after that, I read an article on the accounting side that this network provides the first immutable ledger in human history. And as an accountant, I geek out on ledgers. Most people tune out when you start talking about accounting and ledgers, but accounting and ledgers are the most important operating systems that the world utilizes to run every single bank, government, and corporation within the borders. In Norway, they currently use double entry ledger system. That network, that system was created 700 years ago. And so we've had this old analog double entry system running the world for 700 years. That's very, very bad because anybody who participates on the transaction level of this network, they can change and alter the network. And so when you can change and alter the network, you get devastating fraud in every industry and by every government bank in the world. And it's really difficult to figure out what that fraud is because the people that are controlling the ledgers, they can change the ledgers. Bitcoin, what it did was it created a triple entry from the old double entry standard, and the network self-audits every transaction to its inception and then writes on-chain the triple entry of the accounting ledger. What that does, this triple entry, that's an immutable ledger entry that can never be altered. And so what you have with this Bitcoin network is the first innovation in accounting in 700 years, and that's this immutable entry into a ledger between two parties. Why that's important is because that's the best accounting technology that's ever been created by humans. And so anything that lives on top of this Bitcoin network, which is an accounting innovation, is going to be better than the legacy system that it replaces. Bitcoin, the commodity that you hear a lot about, is the best monetary technology on the planet only because it lives on the best accounting technology on the planet. And the accounting technology is run, for a very long answer to a very short question, on proof of work. And so the proof of work is a consensus mechanism that writes this immutable ledger. There has never been a way to do that prior. Every system that's existed for all of humanity has been a stakeholder-run system. So they're all proof-of-stake systems. Proof-of-stake systems are the legacy systems that existed forever, where the people that control the coins or the stakeholders, they can disrupt that network. They can change it, they can alter it, or they could shut it down. And so this is the first time in human history, only because of proof of work, that you're able to have this immutable ledger and all the other layers for financial and economic freedom.
Thanks, Darren. I want to turn to you, Lynn. So there's this other meeting happening in Davos, the World Economic Forum. They recently tweeted that a basic change in coding could eliminate most of the Bitcoin network's energy demands. And I said, you've heard that Bitcoin fuels the climate crisis, but did you know a software code could clean it up? Miners could stake their own Bitcoins to verify transactions, eliminating most of the network's energy use with a single stroke. And they judge it to be 2,000 times more efficient, given this other consensus mechanism called proof of stake. So if it's possible to improve Bitcoin's energy use and provide the same kinds of freedoms that Bitcoin provides on 1/2000th of the energy, why don't we do that?
Well, one of the first reasons is that actually changing the network is extraordinarily difficult. Changing the rules of how it functions, depending on what type of change you're trying to make, it ranges from impossible to extraordinarily hard. And that's one of the features rather than the bugs, because like most software on the planet, the developers can push updates to you, right? So my Windows, they can just send updates to me, like whatever I'm using, they can just send updates. Whereas Bitcoin, the way it works is all updates are backward compatible and opt-in. So you can choose to upgrade over time. And that's different than many other blockchains and just many types of software we're familiar with. So one is just, it's very hard to do. But number two is that the energy serves, as he described it, a very important role. Basically what the energy does is it minimizes human governance. So if you take out the energy component, you're basically just recreating the prior system, but on the blockchain. You're basically recreating the legacy system where those with the most coins, they control the network. And basically, proof of stake essentially relies on circular logic, where the largest coin holders determine the state of the ledger, and the state of the ledger determines who the largest coin holders are. And so that's kind of like this perpetual motion machine that only works while it's continually operating. And if for whatever reason it encounters a bug or an attack and it goes down, restarting that network is very hard because it's costless to make an infinite number of copies of that ledger. Whereas proof of work, you can't just go out and make alternative copies of the ledger because it's self-evident based on the way it's coded and all the energy that was put into the way it works. It's self-evident which one is the correct prior ledger. And so when those proof of stake systems go down, the major validators have to get together, literally humans in like a Discord group, and they have to manually restart the thing. And that's just basically recreating the old system. And so I never make the argument that, say, proof of stake is useless, but it's just whatever it's doing, it's a very different thing than what Bitcoin's doing. Basically, Bitcoin without the energy, without the work, is like, airplanes with the flight removed, right? It's taking out the key innovation of what makes it so useful.
So let me see if I understand. So, the first point is that it's not actually easy for Bitcoin to update the code. It would involve everyone who is running a node, some tens of thousands of people worldwide, to change their software. That won't in fact happen. So what will happen is effectively just an airdrop of some new coin to everyone who currently holds Bitcoin, and Bitcoin will just continue. Is that the first point? Is that fair?
Well, I think their argument is that if you were to drop coins on people, that people would go over to that system. But we've had ones in the past where, when you have various hard forks, which is a technical way of saying, competing visions of how the network's going to go, users get both coins, and over time, one of them trends towards zero compared to the other one. And so we've seen repeatedly, whenever you try to fork Bitcoin, it's the original Bitcoin that has the serious network effect that keeps operating, and that other version kind of dwindles and has low liquidity, low market cap, low security over time.
Nick, you've said that proof of stake, which is the consensus mechanism that is being advised by the World Economic Forum, among others, for Bitcoin, is just a fancy name for the same system that Bitcoin was designed as an alternative to. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so, proof of stake is pitched as an alternative to proof of work, to Bitcoin's model. I think it's important understanding what Satoshi, the creator of Bitcoin, was trying to do. Their objective was to depoliticize monetary systems, right? And so by default, monetary and payment systems are completely politicized, right? And we've heard a lot of activists telling us this week how their bank accounts have been frozen. I mean, it happens to basically everyone that deeply offends the state in which they live. It's not just an authoritarian thing. It happens in the US, right? There's broad-based financial deplatforming for whole industries that occurs, even in the most advanced Western economies, right? And every single layer of the payment stack and the monetary stack is politicized, right? SWIFT, the ultimate sort of messaging financial layer, we've seen whole countries excluded from that. A lot of people think that's a good idea, but Satoshi proposed an alternative, a fully depoliticized system. And so the proof of work is what allows us to achieve that by basically allowing everybody to decide on the sort of correct state of the ledger with no human oversight or no human governance, right? And so proof of stake is just a fancy way of referring to shareholder governance or a stakeholder-led system where effectively your ownership of the system determines your authority within the system. That's how SWIFT works, right? That's a consortium that effectively the US controls. That's how PayPal works, right? PayPal has shareholders and board of directors, and effectively they determine who's allowed to use the network. That's how banks work, right? Banks, they have a finite number of charters, and basically most banks are heavily regulated. The government can tell them what to do and who to platform and who to deplatform. So those are all proof of stake systems, right? And so saying that you can sort of change Bitcoin to a proof of stake model or promote an alternative, look, these proof of stake systems work fine. They just aren't depoliticized, right? They don't allow just anybody to transact. In my view, money should be depoliticized, right? It should be your right to transact with whomever you want in a private way. And that has been stripped away from us as we've digitized finance. It's all connected to our identity now. And you can definitely be kicked off any financial platform basically at will, and it's getting worse. And so Bitcoin proposed an alternative. Proof of work is the engine that powers that. And so if you strip it out, you just lose the core essence of the system.
Well, let me try to push a little bit on that point. We've heard about people using stablecoins successfully to circumvent financial repression. And those stablecoins are very often running on proof-of-stake systems which use just a mere fraction of Bitcoin's energy. So we do have examples of people successfully using proof-of-stake-based cryptocurrencies to advance human rights, to protect against oppression. Where does it go long term, given that it seems to be working right now to avoid censorship and control? This is for any of you.
I can start there. I mean, stablecoins, I think, are actually a really great tool. There's about $150 billion of stablecoins, and if you want to transact on a public blockchain in a dollar-stable way, stablecoins are a great way to do it. They are, all of the most popular and liquid ones are centrally administered. So, Tether and USDC are the two largest, and there is an entity that controls them and can blacklist accounts and such that you can't redeem your stablecoin for real dollars. And so, they're built to be freezable. Now, are they an improvement over the sort of control that's exerted within the actual traditional financial system? I would say so, yeah, because it's sort of a blacklist rather than a whitelist model. And so it is a lot of work to sort of kick someone off a stablecoin network. And it only happens infrequently. There's only a few hundred people that are sort of banned from Tether or USDC. But that's just not a model that really scales, and it certainly doesn't allow you to transact freely at the end of the day. We do see those issuers booting people off the network.
Yeah, Lynn, would you like to take up this question? How concretely, how does it look, given that people are using stablecoins to circumvent totalitarian repression? What does an attack look like, a long-term attack look like on one of these currencies and networks?
So I think they covered it well. I do think stablecoins are very useful. I've been optimistic about their use in various things. I just think it's important to know that it's not the same thing as a fully decentralized system, right? So essentially what it does is it's still centralized. It just so happens that the central hub might be outside of your country, right? So for example, if you try to hold dollars in a bank account in your country and your country's having a hyperinflation problem, your dollars are likely to be seized by your local bank. Whereas if you were using stablecoins, your entity is outside of the country, so that you can be censored, but it's less likely to happen to you because the entity that's doing it has no real stake in the matter. They don't really care if your currency is hyperinflating. And so as long as that entity is outside of the jurisdiction of the country in question, the funds are relatively safe. The concern is that if larger entities, some of the biggest players in the world, want to really clamp down on stablecoin usage, those entities are centralized and known and do have the capacity to shut off people's usage of the network. So I think he described it well, where it's hard to do it, it's infrequent, but I still think that's a long-range attack vector, whereas something like a fully decentralized Bitcoin network is, I think, a longer-range option that people have. And I think they're different tools for different purposes.
Good. So there's a kind of censorship resistance that comes with proof of work, and proof of work requires energy. And energy is associated with causes emissions, and emissions lead to warming and other kinds of pollution. What kind of price do we have to pay for the freedom that proof of work gives us? And I want to turn to you, Darren, in terms of what does because you're a leader in this industry, what does the energy usage look like for Bitcoin mining? We know it's a lot of energy from some perspectives. How much energy does Bitcoin network use, and what does that energy production and usage look like?
Awesome, thanks for the question. And that is a big misunderstanding globally about how much energy is actually utilized by the system. One quick thing on the proof of stake, stable coins, and Bitcoin proof of work networks. There's only one of those items that is uncorruptible. It's an immutable ledger, and that's Bitcoin. You can corrupt from the administrative stage any one of the other projects that exist that people put in the same bucket as Bitcoin. You cannot corrupt Bitcoin. You cannot alter the records. And that's all due to the proof of work consensus mechanism, which are tens or hundreds of thousands of nodes located globally around the world. In order to hack the Bitcoin network, you would have to hack all of the nodes simultaneously, which is impossible. So we have the first unhackable network in human history. And what that means is the government can't hack it, the hackers can't hack it, and so if you have a Bitcoin on your digital wallet and you hold your keys to it, nobody can take it from you. And for human rights people, that is the first time in human history we've given private property to 8 billion people on the planet, despite what their government says. And so that's one of the other differentiating factors for proof of work and stablecoins and proof of stake tokens that exist that I think is really important to talk about. On the energy footprint, we have one of the biggest intellectually dishonest debates going on globally in almost any industry. On a global basis, and it's really easy to talk about this with the actual statistics. On a global basis, what's really important to understand is how much energy is generated by the world every year. That's the most important metric, because every single time you hear about the global Bitcoin network, what do you hear? That it uses more energy than a small planet. New Zealand, the Netherlands, and they toss in some cities too. The problem with those references, you have no frame of reference. They don't tell you how much energy is generated globally. They just try to scaremonger that this network uses more energy than a small country. But how much is that actually? Well, we know those numbers. And the reason that you never hear them is because it's an inconsequential number. They don't talk about global energy use. But global energy generation is published every year by all the largest energy generation firms in the world. They all publish it, and we know the number. And this is really important for anybody who talks about the energy footprint of this industry. The number is 160,000 terawatt hours of energy are generated globally every single year. And you get the World Economic Forum, who you brought up today. They came out with a paper in 2017 that said by the year 2020, in 3 years, the global Bitcoin network would consume all, just like you, the same papers that you read.
Same math I did.
Yeah, the World Economic Forum.
2011, by the way, I was many years earlier.
There we go, yeah. But by 2020, the World Economic Forum said the global Bitcoin network would consume all the world's energy, all of it. Now we know that's not true. The lights are on. We're utilizing energy for this talk. But how wrong were they? How wrong was the World Economic Forum in 2017 on their prediction? Well, we know how much energy is utilized by the Bitcoin network globally because of the hash rate, because of the equipment. It's approximately 250 terawatt hours of energy. 250 terawatt hours of energy to 160,000 terawatt hours of energy. We're talking about somewhere in the range of 15 to 20 basis points of the world's energy. That's 15 to 20 1/100% of the global world energy. It's an inconsequential number in any jurisdiction that you're in. The problem is it becomes a consequential number when you get to a regional or a local level to make sure that the grids can sustain the additional energy that's on that network.
I want to move to Nick. So that's how much energy it uses, but what's the global impact of Bitcoin mining on the energy system, rather than just how much is it using, but what is its impact on emissions and on the future of energy?
Well, for the most part, Bitcoin's mined with grid energy for now. And so it's really the same as any buyer of power. The thing that's different about it is that Bitcoin miners can locate themselves anywhere, and that's different from any other industry, of course. Other industries need to have roads and infrastructure and resources nearby. Bitcoin miners can locate anywhere. That's why we see a huge influx into West Texas, into Siberia, into hydro-rich areas of upstate New York, Canada, Washington, British Columbia, places where there's abundant energy and no one to use it. And so, that quality is very helpful because it means that you're not actually really competing with the grid itself. The other thing is that Bitcoin miners can turn themselves off and on incredibly short notice, and that means that they can basically respond to commands by grid operators to reduce their usage, which is very useful in grid stabilization.
All right, well, we're out of time. I'd like to thank our speakers. Thank you for coming to this last session. We'll see you at the film tonight. Thank you.
my side? Yeah. How you been?
I've been good. Are there any